The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, shattering the pre-dawn stillness. 3 sharp cracks, followed by screams and the panicked whinnying of horses. Mason Blackwood's eyes snapped open, his hand instinctively reaching for the Remington revolver beside his bed, before his mind had fully awakened. Some instincts never died, even after 15 years of trying to bury them. He moved to the window of his small cabin, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Outside, the Arizona landscape was painted in shades of blue and gray, as dawn approached a heavy mist clinging to the valley floor. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, orange flickers of fire punctuated the fog. Another volley of gunfire. Another scream. A stagecoach ambush. Mason's jaw tightened. Not his concern. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved only brought more trouble. Let Sheriff Hayes and his deputies handle it. That's what the good people of Prosperity paid them for, though they rarely got their money's worth. He turned away from the window, set the revolver on the table, and reached for his shirt. Just another morning in the Arizona Territory, 1877. The West was still wild, despite what the Eastern newspapers claimed. The war had been over for 12 years, but some men had brought the violence home with them, finding they had a taste for it. A woman's scream cut through the morning air, desperate and terrified. Mason closed his eyes, his hands stilling on his shirt buttons. Not your fight. Not anymore. The cabin walls seemed to close in around him, the ghosts of Gettysburg pressing against his conscience. The screams of his men as they fell. The weight of his decisions. The blood on his hands. "Damn it all," he muttered, grabbing his gun belt. 20 minutes later, Mason guided his horse through the mist toward the site of the attack. The mare's hooves were muffled by the damp earth as they approached. The smell hit him, first gunpowder, blood, and smoke scents too familiar from another life. Then the stagecoach came into view, or what remained of it. One wheel was shattered, the coach itself tilted at a severe angle. The horses were gone, likely cut loose by the attackers. 3 bodies lay motionless on the ground. Mason dismounted his boots, landing silently on the soft dirt. His Remington drawn, he moved carefully around the wreckage, eyes scanning for movement, ears alert for the slightest sound. The driver was sprawled across the ground, half his head missing. A shotgun messenger lay nearby his chest, a mess of blood and torn fabric. The third body wore an expensive suit, now ruined with dirt and blood, a banker or businessman most likely. As Mason checked each body for signs of life-finding, none a soft noise caught his attention. A whimper barely audible coming from beneath the stagecoach. He crouched down, peering into the shadows. A young woman was wedged between the luggage compartment and the wheel axle, her blue traveling dress torn and smeared with dirt. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto his. "I'm not going to hurt you," Mason said, his voice rough from disuse. "The attackers are gone. You can come out now." She shook her head, clutching something to her chest, a small leather satchel. "How do I know you weren't with them?" Her voice was stronger than he expected, educated, despite the fear. Mason holstered his revolver slowly. "If I was you'd already be dead like the others." The blunt truth seemed to register with her. "Name's Mason Blackwood. I have a small ranch about 2 miles east of here. Heard the shooting." The woman studied him for a long moment, taking in his weathered face, the flecks of gray in his dark hair, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she began to edge out from her hiding place. "I'm Sarah Fleming," she said as Mason helped her to her feet. She couldn't have been more than 20, with auburn hair escaping from what had once been a neat arrangement. Despite the dirt and blood on her face, not her own, He noted with relief there was a determination in her hazel eyes that reminded him of battlefield nurses he'd known. They came out of nowhere. 6 men, maybe 7. They knew we were coming. Mason frowned. How do you figure that? They called me by name. Sarah's fingers tightened around the leather satchel. They wanted this. Said to give it to them and they'd let me live. Her voice cracked slightly. Mr. Davis, the guard, tried to fight back. That's when they killed everyone. Mason's eyes narrowed. A targeted attack, not a random robbery. What's in the satchel that's worth killing for? Sarah glanced around her, nervously. Not here, please. They might come back. They said they would. As if to punctuate her words, a horse nickered somewhere in the mist. Mason's hand returned to his revolver. Can you ride? Sarah nodded. Then let's go. They reached Mason's horse, and he helped her mount before swinging up behind her. As they rode away from the scene of slaughter, Sarah whispered words that chilled him more than the morning air. Don't let them take it. The future of prosperity depends on it. Mason's cabin was sparse but clean, a testament to military discipline that had never left him. A single room with a bed in one corner, a stone fireplace opposite, and a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs in the center. Rifles hung on one wall, well-maintained. A bookshelf held volumes of military history philosophy and a few dog-eared classics. The only personal touch was a faded daguerreotype on the mantel, a younger Mason in a Union officer's uniform standing beside a stern-faced older man with similar features. Sarah sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The leather satchel rested beside her, still unopened. Some color had returned to her face, but her eyes remained vigilant, darting to the window with every sound from outside. Mason leaned against the wall, studying his unexpected guest. You said they knew your name. Want to tell me who they are? Sarah took a deep breath. Men working for Victor Hargrove. The name hung in the air between them. Everyone in the Arizona Territory knew Victor Hargrove, or knew of him. A wealthy businessman who'd arrived from back east after the war, buying up land and businesses across the territory. The unofficial king of prosperity, the growing town 10 miles south of Mason's cabin. Hargrove has the sheriff and half the town in his pocket, Mason said. Why would he risk having a stagecoach attacked in broad daylight? Because of what my father discovered. Sarah finally unbuckled the satchel, pulling out a folded map and several documents. My father was Robert Fleming, chief engineer for the Western Pacific Railroad extension. Mason's eyebrows rose slightly. The railroad's arrival was all anyone in prosperity had talked about for months. It meant growth opportunity and money, lots of money, for whoever controlled the land around the proposed station and depot. 2 weeks ago, my father wrote to me asking me to come to Prosperity immediately. He said he'd uncovered something that changed everything, but it wasn't safe to put in writing. Sarah's voice trembled slightly. When I arrived in Tucson, I learned he'd been killed in an accident at the construction site. Before I could even arrange to identify his body, his assistant found me. He gave me this satchel and told me to trust no one. She spread the map on the table. It showed Prosperity and the surrounding area with markings indicating the planned railroad route. But there were additional notations in red ink showing a different path cutting through land to the north through Apache territory. The official route goes south of town through land Hargrove has been buying up for years, Sarah explained. But my father discovered something that made him propose this alternate northern route instead. Mason studied the map, noting that the northern route passed near a place marked Eagle Canyon. What did he find? Sarah pulled out another document, a geological survey report. Gold, a massive deposit in Eagle Canyon on Apache land. land that, according to these documents, Hargrove has been secretly trying to claim through fraudulent treaties and government bribes. Mason's jaw tightened. It was an old story in the West, white men finding resources on Indian land and then finding ways to take it legal or otherwise. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice dropping. "Water. The Northern Valley has underground springs that could support prosperity for generations. My father believed that's even more valuable than the gold in the long run. With the railroad and water rights, whoever controls that land controls the future of the entire region." Mason moved to the window, scanning the landscape outside. His cabin sat on high ground with good visibility in all directions. No movement yet, but it wouldn't take Hargrove's men long to track them here. "Why come to me with this?" he asked. "I'm nobody." Sarah's eyes flicked to the daguerreotype on the mantel. "That's not true, Captain Blackwood. Or should I say Captain Mason Ghost, Blackwood, 11th Pennsylvania Cavalry Union Army. The man who led the assault that broke the Confederate line at Cold Harbor. The hero who— That man is dead. Mason cut her off." His voice harsh. "Died at Gettysburg with his men." An uncomfortable silence filled the cabin. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the map. "My father mentioned you. Said if anything happened to him, I should find the recluse rancher east of town. The man who sees everything but says nothing. The man who might still remember what justice looks like." Mason turned back to her, his face unreadable. "Your father was mistaken. I'm not a hero, Miss Fleming. I'm just a man trying to be left alone." "The government agent arriving on tomorrow's train won't be left alone," Sarah countered. "He's coming to review the railroad route and investigate claims of treaty violations with the Apache. If Hargrove gets to him first with his version of events, the northern route will be rejected, the Apache will lose their land, and my father will have died for nothing." Before Mason could respond, his horse whinnied outside a warning. He moved swiftly to the window again, this time spotting dust on the horizon. Riders approaching. "3 men coming fast," he said, reaching for a rifle. "Hargroves?" Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "They want the documents, and they want me silenced." Mason checked the rifle's action, his mind racing through options, escape routes, defensive positions. Skills he'd hoped never to use again. "Why is this worth dying for, Miss Fleming? You could be halfway to California by now." Sarah stood, gathering the documents back into the satchel. "Because my father believed in doing what's right, not what's easy. Because the people of prosperity deserve water that isn't controlled by a tyrant. Because the Apache deserve to keep land that's rightfully theirs." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "Isn't that worth fighting for, Captain?" Outside, the riders drew closer, their forms becoming distinct through the morning haze. Mason's finger rested beside the rifle's trigger, not yet committed. The ghosts of Gettysburg whispered in his ear the weight of command, the cost of courage, the price of turning away. "I stopped fighting other men's battles a long time ago," he said quietly. "Then fight for your own," Sarah replied. "This land is your home too." The riders were close enough now that Mason could make out their features. Hard men with harder eyes, guns drawn and ready. The lead rider was familiar Jed Parker Hargrove's head of security, former Confederate irregular known for his brutality during the war. Time slowed as Mason made his decision, weighing the peace of his solitude against the storm that was coming either way. He'd run from his past for 15 years. Perhaps it was time to stop running. "Get to the cellar," he told Sarah, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "There's a trap door under the rug. Take the satchel and stay down until I call for you." As Sarah hurried to comply, Mason sighted down the barrel at the approaching riders. The familiar calm of impending combat settled over him, his breathing slowing, his hands steady. Some things you never forget, no matter how hard you try. The first shot shattered the morning stillness, and the battle for prosperity's future began. The first rider fell with Mason's opening shot tumbling from his saddle like a rag doll. The other two immediately split apart, one circling left toward the barn, the other right toward a stand of cottonwoods. Tactical trained, not common outlaws. Mason worked the lever on his Winchester, chambering another round as he moved away from the window. Staying in one place was asking for a bullet. He'd learned that lesson at Antietam, watching men die, because they couldn't overcome the instinct to huddle in cover. A shot splintered the window frame, showering him with wood fragments. Mason dropped to one knee, using the solid wall beneath the window as cover. Through the broken glass, he could see the man by the cottonwoods reloading his rifle. Mason rose just enough to line up his shot and squeezed the trigger. The man jerked backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air as he fell. 2 down, 1 to go. The silence that followed was more concerning than the gunfire. Mason couldn't see the third rider from his position. He moved silently across the cabin to the rear window, staying low. No sign of movement by the barn or the corral. Had the man retreated? Unlikely. Hargrove didn't employ men who scared easily. The faint creak of a floorboard from the porch sent a chill down Mason's spine. The third man had reached the cabin. Mason positioned himself beside the door, pressed against the wall, Remington in hand. The door latch moved slowly, cautiously. As the door began to swing inward, Mason held his breath, waiting for the moment when the intruder would be most vulnerable. The barrel of a shotgun appeared first, followed by a shadow. Mason struck like a rattlesnake, grabbing the shotgun barrel and yanking it forward, while simultaneously stepping to the side. The intruder stumbled across the threshold off balance. Mason brought the butt of his revolver down hard on the back of the man's head, sending him crashing to the floor, unconscious. Mason quickly relieved the man of his weapons and used a length of rope to bind his hands and feet. Only then did he get a good look at his face. Not just any of Hargrove's men. This was Tom Reed, the sheriff's deputy. "You can come up now," Mason called, and a moment later the trapdoor opened, revealing Sarah's anxious face. "Are they gone?" she asked, climbing out with the satchel clutched to her chest. "2 are dead. This one's still breathing." Mason nodded toward Reed. Interesting that Hargrove would send the sheriff's deputy to do his dirty work. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized Reed. The sheriff must be in Hargrove's pocket, too. Most likely. Mason checked the ammunition in his revolver and rifle. "We need to move. More will come when these 3 don't return." "Where can we go?" Sarah asked. "If the sheriff's corrupt, we can't go to town." Mason was already gathering supplies, ammunition, dried meat, a canteen of water. "I know a place, an old friend who might be willing to help us." He glanced at the unconscious deputy. "But first, let's find out what he knows." Mason fetched a bucket of water from the well outside and unceremoniously dumped it over Reed's face. The deputy sputtered awake, confusion turning to fear as he registered his situation. "Morning, deputy," Mason said, crouching down to eye level. "Seems you're a long way from town. Mind telling me what brings you to my property with guns drawn?" Reed glared defiantly. "You're harboring a fugitive Blackwood. The girl's wanted for questioning in connection with the stagecoach robbery." "Robbery?" Sarah exclaimed. "They murdered everyone and tried to kill me." "That's not how Hargrove tells it," Reed replied. "Says you and your accomplices attacked the stage, killed those men, and stole important business documents. There's a reward for your capture." Mason's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "And you believed that, or did the money just make it easy to look the other way?" Reed looked away, his defiance cracking. You don't understand what it's like in prosperity now. Hargrove owns everything, the businesses, the land, even most of the houses. Cross him, and you lose everything. So you became his errand boy, Mason said, disgust evident in his voice, doing his killing for him. I never killed nobody, Reed protested. I was just supposed to bring the girl in. Parker and Wilson were Hargrove's men, not lawmen. Mason stood up, towering over the bound deputy. Where's Hayes in all this? The sheriff going along with framing an innocent woman for murder. Reed's hesitation told Mason everything he needed to know. Hayes is a good man, Reed finally said, though he didn't sound convinced. He's just practical, knows which way the wind blows. Sounds like the whole town's bent to Hargrove's will, Mason observed. Not everyone, Reed admitted. Doc Sullivan still speaks her mind, and there's a group of miners and small ranchers who've been meeting secretly talking about standing up to Hargrove, but they're outnumbered and outgunned. Mason exchanged glances with Sarah. Potential allies, perhaps, but risky to trust anyone in prosperity without knowing where their loyalties truly lay. What about the Apache? Mason asked. There's a settlement near Eagle Canyon. Has Hargrove made moves against them yet? Reed looked surprised that Mason knew about the canyon. He's been supplying some of the younger warriors with whiskey, stirring up trouble, trying to provoke an incident that would give the army an excuse to move them off the land. And the government agent arriving tomorrow. What's Hargrove's plan for him? Don't know details. Just heard Parker say they needed to manage him, make sure he sees what Hargrove wants him to see. Reed shifted uncomfortably in his bonds. Look, Blackwood, you need to let me go. When I don't report back, Hargrove will send more men. A lot more. That's exactly what I'm counting on, Mason replied, checking the window again. They'll be looking for us here, which means we'll be elsewhere. He turned to Sarah. Get what you need for travel. We leave in 5 minutes. As Sarah gathered her few belongings, Mason knelt beside Reed once more. One last question, Deputy. The men who attacked the stagecoach, were they instructed to kill everyone, or just get the satchel? Reed swallowed hard. Kill everyone. No witnesses. Mason nodded grimly. That's what I thought. He stood up, considering the deputy for a moment before making a decision. I'm not going to kill you, Reed. Not because you deserve mercy, but because you might still remember what side of the law you're supposed to be on. He checked the ropes to ensure they were secure, but not tight enough to cause injury. Someone will find you eventually. When they do, you've got a choice to make about what kind of man you want to be. 10 minutes later, Mason and Sarah rode away from the cabin, taking a game trail through the dense woods that would be difficult to follow. Mason led the way on his mare, while Sarah rode the horse belonging to one of Hargrove's fallen men. Where are we going? Sarah asked as they entered the shelter of the trees. To see Samuel Cooper, Mason replied. Half Apache, half white, former Army scout, knows this territory better than anyone. Can we trust him? Mason's face softened slightly for the first time since she'd met him. Cooper saved my life in '68 during a skirmish with Comanche raiders. He's one of the few men I'd trust with mine or yours. They rode in silence for a while, the forest growing denser around them. Mason kept a careful watch eyes, scanning for signs of pursuit. So far, nothing, but he knew it wouldn't last. Hargrove wasn't a man who gave up easily. Why did you help me? Sarah asked suddenly. Back at the stagecoach. You could have ridden away, stayed out of all this. Mason didn't answer immediately, his thoughts turning to the nightmares that still plagued him, the faces of his men at Gettysburg looking to him for orders as the Confederate artillery opened up on their exposed position. His mistake. His responsibility. I've spent 15 years trying to outrun my past, he finally said. Never quite managed it. The battle at Gettysburg, Sarah said softly. I read about it. Your regiment was nearly wiped out. Mason's jaw tightened. I gave the order to advance. Bad intelligence, bad timing, bad judgment. I led 87 men into that valley. 17 came out. His voice was flat, emotionless, the pain buried so deep it had become part of him. After that, I couldn't lead men anymore, couldn't bear the weight of those decisions. So you came west, to disappear, to be nobody. Mason guided his horse around a fallen tree. But some debts can't be paid by running away. Sarah studied his profile, understanding dawning on her face. You think helping me might balance the scales somehow? Nothing balances those scales, Mason replied. But maybe it's time I stopped hiding from what I am. And what's that? Before Mason could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, a branch breaking beneath a heavy weight. He reined in his horse, signaling Sarah to stop. His hand moved to his revolver as he scanned the trees, every sense alert. Another crack closer this time. Not pursuit from behind, but someone or something ahead of them. Mason drew his revolver, silently nodding for Sarah to stay put as he dismounted. He moved through the underbrush with practiced stealth, each footfall carefully placed to avoid making sound. 20 yards ahead, he caught a glimpse of movement. A figure crouched beside a fallen log. He circled wide, using the trees for cover, until he was positioned behind the figure. Only then did he recognize the buckskin jacket and dark braided hair. "Hello, Cooper," Mason said quietly. The man didn't startle or reach for a weapon. He simply turned a faint smile on his weathered face. Samuel Cooper was around 30, with features that reflected his mixed heritage, his father's Apache cheekbones and his mother's lighter complexion. His eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who'd learned to navigate two worlds without fully belonging to either. "Ghost," Cooper greeted him, using the old battlefield nickname. "Heard gunshots from the direction of your cabin. Came to see if you needed burying." "Not yet," Mason replied, holstering his revolver, "though some might be trying to arrange it." Cooper nodded, as if this was no surprise. "Hargrove's men. They've been asking questions about you in town. Seems you've finally managed to be interesting again." His eyes shifted to where Sarah waited with the horses. "And with company, no less. The world truly is full of wonders." Mason made a gesture for Sarah to join them. "She needs our help, Sam, and I think you might need hers, too." Cooper's expression grew serious. "This about Eagle Canyon. You know about that. My people have known about the gold for generations, left it in the ground where it belongs." Cooper's voice took on a bitter edge. "But now that white men have discovered it suddenly, our land isn't ours anymore." Sarah approached cautiously, the leather satchel still secured to her side. Cooper assessed her with a glance, noting her educated bearing and determined expression. "Samuel Cooper," Mason said by way of introduction, "this is Sarah Fleming. Her father was the railroad engineer who discovered what Hargrove is really after." "Was?" Cooper asked. "Hargrove had him killed," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the pain behind the words. "Made it look like an accident." Cooper nodded grimly. "He's good at making murder look like misfortune." "We need a safe place," Mason explained. "Somewhere to regroup and figure out how to get Sarah's evidence to the government agent arriving tomorrow." Cooper considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I know a place. Old trapper's cabin near the canyon. My father uses it sometimes when hunting. It's well hidden." "Your father, the chief, he knows what's happening?" Mason asked. "Chief Gray Eagle sees more than most men half his age," Cooper confirmed. He's been watching Hargrove's movements, the way he's trying to divide our young men with whiskey and false promises. There's trouble coming, Ghost, the kind that ends with blood on both sides. A distant sound caught Mason's attention. Hoofbeats faint, but growing louder. We need to move. Now. Cooper led them deeper into the forest, away from the game trail, and onto narrower paths that would be difficult for horses to follow. They rode in single file, moving as quickly as the dense underbrush would allow. After an hour of hard riding, they emerged onto a ridge overlooking a vast canyon, Eagle Canyon, its red rock walls catching the midday sun, a small river winding along its floor. There, Cooper pointed to a distant plateau halfway up the canyon wall. The cabin is there. Impossible to approach without being seen with fresh water from a spring and good lines of sight in all directions. As they made their way down a narrow switchback trail toward the canyon floor, Sarah gasped, suddenly pointing back the way they had come. A column of dark smoke rose above the tree line miles in the distance. "Your cabin," she said to Mason. Mason watched the smoke for a moment, his expression unreadable. Everything he owned was in that cabin. Not much, but it had been his home for over a decade. "Hargrove doesn't leave loose ends," Cooper observed. "Neither do I," Mason replied, his voice hardening with resolve. The burning of his cabin had severed his last tie to his quiet, isolated life. There was no going back now. "Let's keep moving. We have a lot of planning to do before tomorrow." They continued down into the canyon, unaware that at that very moment in Prosperity, Sheriff William Hayes was staring at the bodies of Parker and Wilson laid out in his office by Hargrove's men. The message was clear: find Blackwood and the girl, or join them. Hayes removed his badge, turning it over in his hands as he considered his options. He'd known this day would come eventually, the day when he'd have to choose between Hargrove's money and his own conscience. What he hadn't expected was that Mason Blackwood would be at the center of it all. Blackwood. The name brought back memories of mud and blood and the thunder of artillery at Cold Harbor. Hayes touched the scar on his cheek unconsciously, a permanent reminder of the day Captain Ghost Blackwood had led the charge that broke the Confederate line. The day Hayes, then a Confederate lieutenant, had watched his entire company die. "Tell Mr. Hargrove I'll handle it personally," Hayes told the waiting men, pinning his badge back on his chest. Some debts could only be paid in blood. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, storm clouds gathered above Prosperity, casting long shadows over the town's future and the lives of those who would determine its fate. The trapper's cabin was little more than a one-room shelter built of stone and timber, but its position on the plateau made it a natural fortress. From its single window, Mason could see for miles across Eagle Canyon the ruddy landscape stretching toward distant mountains. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor, turning the river below into a ribbon of liquid gold. Inside, Sarah spread her father's documents across a rough-hewn table, while Cooper tended a small fire. Mason cleaned his Remington methodically, the familiar routine calming his mind as he considered their options. "The government agent arrives on tomorrow's train," Sarah said, tracing a finger along the railroad line marked on her father's map. "According to his letter to my father, he'll be conducting an official survey of the proposed route and investigating claims about treaty violations with the Apache." "Hargrove will have a welcoming committee waiting," Mason observed. "The agent will be surrounded by Hargrove's men from the moment he steps off that train." Cooper nodded grimly. "And Hayes will have wanted posters with your faces on them by morning. The official story will be that you murdered those men at your ranch and robbed the stagecoach." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she shuffled through more papers. "We need to get these documents to the agent somehow," They prove everything: the legitimate boundaries of Apache land, the fraudulent treaties Hargrove has been pushing, the geological surveys showing gold and water in Eagle Canyon. She looked up at Mason. My father died for these papers. They're the only chance to stop Hargrove. Mason set his revolver aside and moved to study the maps. Eagle Canyon and its surrounding lands were marked with detailed notations about water sources, mineral deposits, and topographical features. Robert Fleming had been thorough in his documentation. We can't approach the agent directly, Mason said. Not with Hayes and his deputies watching the station. We need someone in town who can help us, someone Hargrove doesn't suspect. Cooper stoked the fire thoughtfully. Dr. Eleanor Sullivan, he suggested. She's treated my people when others wouldn't. Never asked for payment. She has no love for Hargrove, especially after... He trailed off, exchanging a significant look with Mason. After what? Sarah asked. Mason's jaw tightened. Eleanor's husband owned the town's newspaper, wrote an article about questionable land deals just after Hargrove arrived. 3 days later, he died in a printing accident. Press fell on him. Convenient, Sarah said bitterly. Eleanor's been running the medical practice alone since then, Cooper continued. She's respected enough that Hargrove can't touch her openly, but everyone knows she blames him for her husband's death. Mason nodded. She might be willing to help, but getting to her without being seen won't be easy. I can go, Cooper offered. My people trade with some of the merchants in town. No one questions when I'm there. It's too risky, Mason countered. You're known to be my friend. They'll be watching for you. Cooper's dark eyes held a hint of amusement. Ghost, I tracked Comanche war parties for the Army when I was 17. I think I can avoid a few town deputies. Before Mason could respond, a faint sound caught his attention, a bird call that didn't belong to any species native to the canyon. Cooper tensed his hand, moving to the knife at his belt. My father's signal, he explained quietly. Someone's coming. Mason moved swiftly to the window rifle in hand. In the fading light, he could make out a small group ascending the switchback trail, 5 riders moving carefully in the gathering dusk. Apache? Sarah asked nervously. Cooper shook his head. Mixed group. My father's in front. The others... He squinted through the dying light. Miners, by the look of them. 10 minutes later, Chief Gray Eagle ducked through the cabin's low doorway. Despite being in his 70s, the Apache leader moved with the fluid grace of a much younger man. His face was a map of deep lines and old scars, his long silver hair bound in 2 braids. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache garments and practical American clothing. Buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt, and a weathered army jacket that had seen many winters. Behind him came 4 men in miners' clothes, their faces grimy with dust and suspicion. They eyed Mason warily, clearly recognizing him, but uncertain of his role in the unfolding events. Gray Eagle spoke first, his English deliberate but fluent. The spirits have strange humor bringing the ghost back to our lands after so many seasons. Mason inclined his head respectfully. It's been a long time, Chief. Not so long that I forget a debt, the older man replied, touching a faded scar on his forearm, a wound that would have killed him had Mason not intervened during a raid years before. These men, Gray Eagle continued, gesturing to the miners, come seeking the one who stands against Hargrove. Word travels fast through the mountains. The oldest of the miners, a barrel-chested man with a gray-streaked beard, stepped forward. Name's Caleb Wilson. We run independent claims north of town. Hargrove's been squeezing us out for months, raising fees for using his stamp mill, charging for water rights on land that ain't his. His weathered face hardened. Heard about what happened at your place, Blackwood. Figured if you're against Hargrove, maybe we have common cause. Mason studied the men carefully. Allies were valuable, but trust came at a premium in the territories. What exactly are you offering Wilson? Information for starters. Hargrove's called a town meeting for tonight, announcing some big plans for when the government man arrives tomorrow. Got the whole town riled up about Apache raids that ain't happened. Cooper and his father exchanged knowing glances. He's creating a pretext, Sarah realized. Setting the stage to blame the Apache for violence he's orchestrating himself. But there's more, another miner added. Hayes has deputized 20 men since this morning. They're searching every cabin and camp within 10 miles of town. Mason processed this information, weighing their options. The noose was tightening faster than he'd anticipated. We need to know exactly what Hargrove's planning, he decided. And we need to get word to Dr. Sullivan about the agent. The woman doctor already knows you're coming, Gray Eagle said, his expression unreadable. The spirits whispered to her in dreams. The miners shifted uncomfortably at the chief's mystical reference, but Mason understood the practical meaning behind it. You've already spoken with her. Gray Eagle's eyes crinkled slightly. My son is not the only one who can move unseen through the white man's town. A plan began to form in Mason's mind, dangerous but with potential. Wilson, can your men create a distraction tomorrow? Draw attention away from the train station when the agent arrives. The miner nodded. We can stir up trouble at the stamp mill. Most of Hayes's deputies would respond to that. It's Hargrove's prize operation. Good. Mason turned to Cooper. We'll need to split up. You and Sarah take the documents to Sullivan tonight. She can get them to the agent during the official welcome. I'll create another distraction on the South Road, make them think we're trying to flee toward Tucson. And you, Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice, what happens when they realize you're alone? Mason's expression hardened. I've led men on diversionary actions before, and left most of them dead in a Pennsylvania valley, she countered. I'm not letting you sacrifice yourself. There has to be another way. The cabin fell silent, tension crackling like the fire's embers. Mason's jaw tightened at the reference to Gettysburg, but he couldn't deny the tactical reality. A diversion would likely be a one-way mission. It was Gray Eagle who broke the silence. There is another path. He moved to the table and studied Fleming's maps with keen interest. The old mining tunnels. They run beneath Prosperity from before Hargrove's time. Most of those collapsed years ago, Wilson objected. Not all, the chief replied. My people have used them to move unseen. They connect to the cellars of several buildings in town, including the doctor's house. Mason considered this new information. Underground passage would allow them to bypass Hayes's patrols entirely. Where's the nearest entrance? Gray Eagle pointed to a location on the map about 3 miles from their current position. There, hidden in a dry creek bed. The tunnels are old and dangerous in places, but they will take you beneath the town. The plan evolved quickly after that. Cooper and 2 of the miners would escort Sarah through the tunnels to Sullivan's house tonight. Mason would remain at the cabin with Gray Eagle and the others, preparing for tomorrow's confrontation at the train station. If all went well, they would present their evidence to the government agent before Hargrove could implement whatever scheme he was planning. As the others discussed details, Mason stepped outside onto the plateau. The night had fully descended now, stars piercing the darkness above the canyon. In the distance, the lights of Prosperity glowed like fallen stars, deceptively peaceful. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to find Sarah watching him, her expression troubled in the moonlight. I shouldn't have mentioned Gettysburg, she said quietly. It was unfair. Mason looked back toward the town. It was accurate. I've led men to their deaths before. It's not something I'm eager to repeat. My father wrote about you in his journal, Sarah said, moving to stand beside him. He called you a good man carrying too much weight. Said you watched over this valley like a silent guardian, even though most people in town barely knew you existed. Mason raised an eyebrow. Your father and I spoke maybe 3 times in all the years I lived here. He was a good judge of character, Sarah replied. Said he'd rather have one Mason Blackwood on his side than 20 men who didn't understand the weight of their decisions. She pulled her shawl tighter against the night chill. I think he knew Hargrove would come after him eventually. That's why he wanted me to find you. The responsibility settled on Mason's shoulders, familiar and unwelcome. I'm not the man your father thought I was. Haven't been for a long time. Perhaps, Sarah said, studying his profile in the moonlight. Or perhaps that man's been here all along, just waiting for the right cause. Before Mason could respond, Cooper emerged from the cabin. Time to move, he said quietly. If we're going to reach the tunnel entrance before midnight, we need to leave now. Sarah turned to go, then hesitated. Be careful, Captain, she said, her voice softening. This cause needs you alive, not as a martyr. As she followed Cooper down the path, Mason felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose he'd thought long dead buried with his men at Gettysburg. Whether it would lead to redemption or further damnation remained to be seen. Inside the cabin, Gray Eagle was studying Fleming's maps with intense focus. He looked up as Mason entered, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. You carry many ghosts, Blackwood, the chief observed. They weigh on your spirit like stones. Mason didn't bother denying it. We all have our burdens. True, Gray Eagle agreed. But not all burdens are ours to carry. Some were placed on our backs by others. Some we picked up by choice. He tapped the map deliberately. Choose carefully which ones you carry forward from this canyon. Before Mason could ponder the chief's cryptic advice, one of Wilson's men burst through the door, his face taut with alarm. Riders coming up the trail, he reported breathlessly. At least a dozen, moving fast. Mason moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Torches flickered in the distance, marking the approach of mounted men. They'd been found sooner than expected. Hayes, he asked. The miner shook his head. Didn't look like the sheriff's men. These fellows wore dusters, had their faces covered. More like hired guns. Hargrove isn't taking chances, Mason muttered. He's bringing in outside muscle. He turned to Gray Eagle. Is there another way down from this plateau? The chief nodded. A path along the western ridge. Difficult in darkness, but passable. Get your men out that way, Mason instructed Wilson. No sense in all of us getting caught. Make for the tunnel entrance. Tell Cooper and Sarah what happened. Wilson hesitated. What about you? Mason checked his Winchester, ensuring it was fully loaded. I'll delay them. Give you time to get clear. That's suicide, Blackwood, the miner protested. Must be 12-15 men out there. I've faced worse odds, Mason replied, though in truth he hadn't faced any odds at all in 15 years of hiding from his past. Go, now. As Wilson and his men slipped out the back of the cabin toward the western path, Gray Eagle remained calmly loading an ancient but well-maintained Henry rifle. You should go with them, Mason told him. The chief shook his head. My son says you were called Ghost in the war. Because you appeared from nowhere, struck like lightning, then vanished before the enemy could respond. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. Let us see if the ghost still knows how to fight. The approaching riders were still 5 minutes away, enough time for Mason and Gray Eagle to prepare a proper welcome. They extinguished the fire in the cabin, plunging the interior into darkness that would allow them to see out while preventing anyone from seeing in. Mason positioned himself at the window, while Gray Eagle took up station by a gap in the rear wall that served as a second firing position. "No killing shots if you can avoid it," Mason instructed. "We want to discourage them, not create martyrs for Hargrove's cause." Gray Eagle nodded, though his expression suggested he had fewer reservations about lethal force. "The men who threaten my people's land will find no mercy in my heart." "I understand," Mason replied, "but dead men can't testify against Hargrove. We need witnesses, not corpses." The riders drew closer, their torches illuminating dust kicked up by their horses. Mason could make out their forms now, rough men, professional gun hands, by the look of them, not local deputies. They approached with caution, spreading out to surround the cabin rather than charging directly. Their leader, a tall figure on a pale horse, signaled for them to halt just beyond effective rifle range. "Blackwood," the leader called out, "we know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." Mason remained silent, watching their movements carefully. The men were positioning themselves with tactical precision, seeking cover behind rocks and sparse vegetation. These weren't common bandits, they had military training or extensive experience. "Last chance, Blackwood," the leader shouted again. "The girl and the documents, that's all we want. Cooperate, and Mr. Hargrove is prepared to be generous." When no response came, the leader made a sharp gesture. 3 riders dismounted and began advancing toward the cabin using the terrain for cover. The others maintained their positions, rifles ready. Mason sighted carefully on the nearest advancing man, aiming for his leg. The Winchester cracked in the night air, and the man went down with a cry of pain, clutching his thigh. Immediately, the night erupted in gunfire as the other riders opened fire on the cabin. Bullets splintered the wooden shutters and thudded into the stone walls. Gray Eagle's Henry spoke next, the bullet striking the ground near another advancing man, forcing him to dive for cover. The old chief's aim was deliberate, a warning shot respecting Mason's instruction while effectively halting the advance. The firefight continued for several minutes, Mason and Gray Eagle taking carefully placed shots while their opponents wasted ammunition firing at the darkened cabin. 2 more attackers were wounded, neither fatally, before the leader called for a ceasefire. In the sudden silence, Mason could hear the men conferring clearly, reconsidering their approach. Then came a sound that chilled his blood, the distinctive whoosh of a flaming arrow arcing through the night sky, followed by another and another. The arrows struck the cabin's wooden roof, which had been baked dry by months of Arizona sun. "They're trying to burn us out," Mason muttered, firing at a shadowy figure knocking another arrow. Gray Eagle's expression remained impassive. "A predictable strategy. They lack imagination." The flames spread quickly across the roof timbers. Within minutes, the cabin would become untenable. Mason's mind raced through options, none of them promising. They were outnumbered, and soon to be without cover. "The cellar," Gray Eagle said suddenly, moving toward the center of the cabin's dirt floor. He pulled aside a worn hide rug, revealing a trapdoor similar to the one in Mason's cabin. "Root storage. Connects to a narrow tunnel. Too small for most white men, but you are thin from your years of brooding." And despite the dire situation, Mason felt a grudging smile tug at his lips. "You knew about this escape route all along." "Of course," the chief replied, pulling open the trapdoor. "I am old, not foolish. I do not fight battles I cannot win." As smoke began to fill the cabin, they descended into the cramped cellar. Gray Eagle led the way through a narrow tunnel barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. They emerged 10 minutes later in a small ravine, 100 yards from the cabin, which was now fully engulfed in flames, illuminating the night and the frustrated gunmen surrounding it. "They will search when they find no bodies," Gray Eagle said as they crouched in the darkness. "We must move quickly." "The tunnel entrance where Cooper and Sarah were headed," Mason said. "Can we reach it from here?" Gray Eagle nodded. "This way." As they made their way through the rugged terrain, keeping to shadows and using the canyon walls for cover, Mason's thoughts turned to Sarah and Cooper. Had they reached Sullivan's house safely, or had Hargrove somehow anticipated their plan? The sound of a gunshot echoed across the canyon, followed by shouts. The gunmen had discovered their escape. The hunt was on. Dawn broke over Prosperity, painting the dusty streets in hues of gold and amber. From her position at Dr. Sullivan's second-floor window, Sarah watched the town come to life. Merchants opened their shops, miners trudged toward Hargrove's stamp mill, and housewives emerged to sweep their porches. Normal activities on what promised to be anything but a normal day. "See anything?" Eleanor Sullivan asked, joining her at the window. The doctor was a handsome woman in her 40s, her brown hair streaked with premature gray, her eyes sharp with intelligence and barely concealed grief. Despite the early hour, she was fully dressed in a practical dark skirt and white blouse, a stethoscope hanging around her neck. "Hayes has men at both ends of the main street," Sarah reported. "They're checking everyone who enters town." Sullivan nodded grimly. "They've been at it all night. Searched my clinic around midnight, but they didn't think to check the house." She glanced toward the cellar door where Cooper had concealed himself after guiding Sarah through the mining tunnels. "Your Apache friend knows his way around underground." "Any word about Mason and the others?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "Nothing certain. Rumors of gunfire in the canyon." "A fire." Sullivan's expression softened. "Blackwood's survived worse. If anyone can make it through, he will." Sarah turned from the window, her hands tightening around her father's leather satchel. "The train arrives at noon. We need to get these documents to the government agent before Hargrove can control the narrative." "It won't be easy," Sullivan warned. "Hargrove's planned quite a welcome. Town meeting last night was all about the Apache threat and how the new railroad will bring protection and prosperity." Her mouth twisted in disgust. "He's got most folks believing the Apache are on the verge of attacking, that the Golden Eagle Canyon rightfully belongs to the town, and that your father was somehow conspiring against Prosperity's interests." "That's absurd," Sarah protested. "My father wanted to ensure the town had a sustainable water supply for generations. The northern route would have guaranteed that." "Truth is often the first casualty when money's involved," Sullivan replied. She moved to her medical bag and removed a false bottom, revealing a hidden compartment. "We should conceal the most critical documents here. I'll keep them with me at the welcome ceremony. As the town doctor, I'm expected to attend, and Hargrove won't risk having me searched publicly." As Sarah carefully selected the most damning evidence against Hargrove, a soft knock came from the cellar door. Cooper emerged, his expression tense. "Riders coming from the canyon," he reported. "Two men moving fast toward town. One of them is Ghost." Sarah's heart leapt. "Mason made it with my father," Cooper confirmed, though his relief was tempered with concern. "They're being pursued. At least 8 riders, maybe more." Sullivan moved quickly to the window. "They'll never make it through Hayes's checkpoints. They're not heading for the main road," Cooper explained. "They're circling around to the tunnel entrance behind the livery stable." Sullivan nodded. "Smart. That tunnel comes up in Old Man Weber's tannery just 2 blocks from here." She turned to Sarah. "We need to create a distraction. Something to pull Hayes's their posts long enough for Blackwood to reach us." Sarah thought quickly. What about the miners? They were supposed to create a diversion at the stamp mill. "Too soon," Cooper objected. "They're waiting for the train's arrival." Sullivan considered for a moment, then moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small bottle of clear liquid. "Ether," she explained. "Highly flammable. If something were to catch fire near the saloon—" "The ammunition store is right next door," Sarah realized. "Exactly. Not close enough to cause real damage, but the threat would draw every able body to contain it." Sullivan's eyes held a fierce determination. "My husband wasn't the only one who knew how to fight Hargrove. I've just been waiting for the right moment." Cooper nodded in approval. "I'll go. I can move through town without drawing attention." "No," Sullivan countered. "You're known to be Blackwood's friend. Hayes's men will be watching for you specifically." She took the ether bottle and wrapped it carefully in a cloth. "I'm just the town doctor making my morning rounds. No one will question me." Before either could protest, Sullivan swept from the room, medical bag in hand. Through the window, Sarah watched her walk calmly down the street, nodding to townspeople as she passed the very picture of professional propriety. "She's braver than most warriors I know," Cooper observed. "Will it work?" Sarah asked. Cooper's expression was grim. "It has to. Otherwise, Ghost and my father won't live to see midday." Mason and Gray Eagle crouched in the shadow of a abandoned mine shaft, their horses hidden in a nearby ravine. They had ridden hard through the night, evading Hargrove's men through the chief's intimate knowledge of the canyon's hidden trails. Now, with dawn breaking, they had reached the outskirts of prosperity, but their pursuers were closing in. "The tunnel entrance is 50 yards ahead," Gray Eagle said, pointing toward a depression behind the town livery stable, concealed beneath old mining equipment. Mason surveyed the area, noting the 2 deputies positioned on the stable's roof, rifles in hand. "They're watching the approaches. Someone must have guessed we'd come this way." "Hayes," Gray Eagle suggested. "He knows your methods from the war." The mention of Hayes brought a flood of unwelcome memories. William Hayes, then a Confederate lieutenant, had been one of the few survivors when Mason's cavalry charge broke through their lines at Cold Harbor. Mason had personally captured him wounded and defiant. They had spent 3 days together as Mason escorted the prisoner back to Union lines, 3 days of conversation, grudging respect, and ultimately an understanding that transcended the uniform each man wore. After the war, Mason had been surprised to encounter Hayes in Arizona territory, but they had maintained a careful distance, acknowledging each other with nods when their paths crossed in town, but never speaking of shared history. Now it seemed Hayes had chosen his side. "There's no approach without being seen," Mason observed, studying the deputies' positions. "Perhaps we do not need to approach unseen," Gray Eagle replied. His weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Sometimes the most obvious path is the one least expected." Mason raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting? That the ghost becomes visible?" Before Mason could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the town's main street. Shouts of "Fire!" echoed across the buildings, followed by the sound of running feet. The deputies on the stable roof stood craning their necks to see the source of the alarm. "Sullivan," Mason realized with grim appreciation. "She's created our diversion." One of the deputies called down to someone inside the stable, then both men clambered down and ran toward the commotion, leaving their post unattended. "Now!" Gray Eagle urged, and they sprinted across the open ground to the tunnel entrance. The depression behind the stable was filled with discarded mining equipment, Broken ore carts, rusted rails, rotting support timbers. Gray Eagle moved unerringly to a pile of warped boards and cast them aside, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. "I go first," the chief said, lowering himself into the hole with surprising agility for his age. "Follow close. The tunnel forks many times." Mason glanced back at their pursuer's dust on the horizon before descending into the darkness after Gray Eagle. The tunnel was cramped and musty, forcing them to crouch as they moved through the underground passage. The only light came from occasional cracks in the ceiling, where the tunnel passed beneath foundations or water pipes. "Prosperity was built atop an older mining settlement," Gray Eagle explained as they navigated the darkness. "These tunnels connect many buildings. The white men forgot about them when the first silver played out." They reached a junction where the tunnel split in 3 directions. Gray Eagle hesitated, then chose the right-hand passage. "This way leads to the tannery. From there we can reach the doctor's house." As they moved deeper beneath the town, Mason became aware of a rhythmic pounding overhead. The stamp mill starting its daily operation, crushing ore to extract precious metals. The noise grew louder as they progressed, eventually becoming deafening. "We're beneath the mill now," Gray Eagle shouted over the din. "Keep moving." Suddenly, the tunnel ahead collapsed in a shower of dirt and timber. Mason grabbed the chief and pulled him back, just as tons of earth crashed down, blocking their path completely. The vibrations from the mill, Mason realized. The tunnels can't withstand it. Gray Eagle pointed to a narrow side passage they had just passed. "Another way, longer but safer." The alternative route twisted beneath the town, gradually sloping upward. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes, they reached a wooden door set into the tunnel wall. Gray Eagle pushed it open cautiously, revealing a cellar stacked with barrels and crates. "The general store," he whispered. "Not where we intended, but close enough." They climbed the cellar stairs and found themselves in a storeroom filled with dry goods and supplies. Through a crack in the door, Mason could see the store's main room, where the proprietor was serving a customer, one of Hayes's deputies. "We need another way out," Mason muttered. Gray Eagle pointed to a small window near the ceiling. "There, it opens to the alley behind." The window was narrow, but they managed to squeeze through, dropping silently into the alley behind the general store. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, and shouts could still be heard from the direction of the saloon. "Sullivan's diversion is holding their attention," Mason observed. "Her house is 2 blocks from here." They moved carefully through back alleys, avoiding the main street where deputies and townspeople were still dealing with whatever fire Sullivan had started. As they approached the doctor's house from the rear, a figure stepped from the shadows, Cooper rifle in hand. "Took you long enough," he greeted them, relief evident beneath his casual tone. "Began to think you'd stopped for breakfast." Gray Eagle clasped his son's shoulder. "The old tunnels are becoming dangerous." The one beneath the mill collapsed. Cooper led them to a back door which opened before they reached it. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face lighting with relief at the sight of Mason. "You made it," she said softly as they slipped inside. Mason's normally stoic expression softened momentarily. "Told you I've faced worse odds." The kitchen they entered was warm and smelled of coffee and baking bread, jarringly normal given the circumstances. Sullivan entered from the front of the house, her face flushed with exertion, but her eyes bright with triumph. "Small chemical fire near the saloon," she explained. "Caused quite a panic when someone yelled that it might spread to the ammunition store. Hayes has every available man forming a bucket line." Her expression grew serious. "But it won't distract them for long. The train arrives in 3 hours, and Hargrove's planned an elaborate welcome ceremony in the town square." Mason accepted a cup of coffee from Sarah, the warmth seeping into hands chilled from the underground journey. "What's the situation with the documents?" "I've hidden the most crucial evidence in my medical bag," Sullivan replied. "As town doctor, I'm expected to attend the welcome ceremony. I can approach the government agent under the guise of medical courtesy, checking if he needs anything after his journey." "Risky," Mason commented. "Hargrove will be watching you." "He'll be watching everyone," Sullivan acknowledged, "but he can't stop me from performing my duties without raising suspicion." Sarah spread a town map across the kitchen table. "Dr. Sullivan's had a patient in almost every building on the main street. She knows which ones might offer shelter if we need it." Mason studied the map carefully. "We need a fallback plan in case Sullivan can't reach the agent, and we need to be prepared for Hargrove to make his move against the Apache." Gray Eagle's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes reflected deep concern. "My people are ready. The women and children have moved to the high caves. The warriors prepare, but we are few against Hargrove's many guns." "He wants a confrontation," Cooper added. "An excuse to call in the army. If even one Apache warrior attacks a settler, Hargrove will use it to justify seizing the entire canyon." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen as the enormity of their task settled on each of them. They were 5 people standing against a man who controlled an entire town with wealth, influence, and hired guns at his disposal. It was Sarah who broke the silence, her voice steady despite the fear she must have felt. "My father believed that truth could stand against any force if brave people were willing to bear witness to it." She looked at each of them in turn. "We are those witnesses. We cannot fail." Mason studied her for a long moment. Robert Fleming had clearly passed his courage and conviction to his daughter. "We won't," he promised, though he knew better than most how easily such promises could be broken on the battlefield. A knock at the front door startled them all. Cooper and Mason moved instantly to defensive positions, weapons ready. Sullivan motioned for them to stay hidden as she went to answer it. Through the kitchen doorway, Mason could see Sullivan speaking with someone on the porch, an elderly man in a miner's clothes, his expression urgent. After a brief conversation, Sullivan closed the door and returned to the kitchen. "That was old Weber from the tannery," she reported. "Hayes is conducting house-to-house searches, working his way down from the north end of town. They'll reach us within the hour." "The tunnels," Cooper began. Sullivan shook her head. "Hayes has men checking every cellar and crawl space. The collapse under the mill has made them suspicious of underground movement." "We need to split up," Mason decided. "We're too conspicuous together." "The church has a hidden space in the bell tower," Sullivan suggested, "used by the Underground Railroad before the war. Cooper and his father could conceal themselves there." "What about you and Sarah?" Cooper asked. Mason considered their options. "Sullivan stays here. As far as anyone knows, she's just the town doctor going about her business. Sarah comes with me." "Where?" Sarah asked. "The last place they'd expect to find us," Mason replied grimly. "Hargrove's own office at the stamp mill." Sullivan's eyes widened. "That's either brilliant or suicidal." "Often a fine line between the two," Mason acknowledged. He turned to Gray Eagle and Cooper. "If we're not at the train station by noon, proceed with Sullivan's plan. Get the documents to the government agent at any cost." Gray Eagle nodded solemnly. "May the spirits watch over you, Ghost." As they prepared to separate, each taking different routes to their destinations, Sarah pulled Mason aside. "Are you certain about Hargrove's office? It seems like walking into the lion's den." "Sometimes the most dangerous place is the safest," Mason replied. "Hayes will have his men searching everywhere except where Hargrove already controls. and I want to see what the man's been planning. People like Hargrove keep records evidence of their own importance. Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. My father would have appreciated the audacity. Your father, Mason said quietly, would have preferred you safely back east, not risking your life in a frontier dispute. My father, she countered, raised me to stand for what's right, regardless of the cost. Her eyes met his unwavering, just as your men once trusted you to lead them even knowing the danger. The reference to his regiment struck Mason like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Cooper returned from checking the street outside. Clear for now, he reported. But we need to move. Hayes's men are working their way down Main Street. They exited through the back door, separating into pairs and disappearing into the warren of alleys and side streets that formed Prosperity's less respectable quarters. As Mason and Sarah made their way toward the imposing structure of Hargrove's stamp mill, neither noticed the figure watching from a second-story window of the hotel across the street. Sheriff William Hayes, his face set in grim determination as he tracked their movement. Hayes turned from the window and faced the man seated comfortably in an armchair, sipping whiskey despite the early hour. You were right, Hayes said. Sullivan's involved, and they're heading toward your office. Victor Hargrove smiled thinly, setting down his glass. In his 50s, with silver hair and the refined manners of Eastern society, he hardly looked like the ruthless businessman who had built an empire in the Arizona Territory through intimidation and violence. His tailored suit and gold watch chain spoke of wealth, while his cold eyes revealed the calculated ambition that had acquired it. Predictable, Hargrove remarked. Blackwood always did prefer the bold approach even in war. He stood straightening his jacket with practiced precision. Let them proceed. Everything is in place for our demonstration when the agent arrives. And Blackwood, Hayes asked, his hand unconsciously touching the scar on his cheek. Hargrove's smile never reached his eyes. I believe I promised you would have the honor, Sheriff. A debt from Cold Harbor, as I recall. Hayes nodded, checking his revolver. Some debts can only be paid one way. Indeed, Hargrove agreed, lifting his glass in a mock toast. To debts paid in full. As the morning sun climbed higher over Prosperity, casting the shadow of the stamp mill across the town like a premonition, the stage was set for a reckoning long in the making. The train carrying the government agent was less than 2 hours away, and with it, the future of Prosperity Eagle Canyon, and everyone caught in the struggle between greed and justice. Hargrove's stamp mill dominated Prosperity's eastern edge, its massive wooden structure belching black smoke into the clear Arizona sky. The constant thunder of stamps crushing ore, the mechanical heartbeat of the town, drowned out all other sounds as Mason and Sarah approached from the rear, using stacks of lumber for cover. The main office is on the second floor, Sarah whispered, pointing to a window overlooking the yard. My father met with Hargrove there once, said it was like a piece of Boston dropped into the desert. Mason studied the building's layout, noting exits and workers' positions. How do we get in without being seen? There's a back staircase for deliveries, she replied. Rarely guarded, Hargrove prefers showing off his imported goods through the main entrance. They slipped through the delivery door while workers were distracted ascending to the second floor. The contrast was immediate, polished hardwood oak-paneled walls, and the smell of leather and cigars replaced industrial grime. They moved silently toward the main office at the end of the hallway. Mason tried the door unlocked. Too easy. His instincts prickled with warning, but they had come too far to turn back. With a nod to Sarah, he pushed it open. Hargrove's office was indeed transplanted Eastern opulence. Leather-bound books lined walnut shelves, land surveys covered one wall, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the center. Through tall windows, prosperity lay spread below, like a kingdom before its ruler. "Check the desk," Mason instructed, moving to examine the maps. "Look for anything related to Eagle Canyon or the Apache lands." Sarah searched through papers while Mason studied a detailed survey with recent annotations in red ink. It showed Eagle Canyon and surrounding Apache lands, but with overlays indicating mining claims and property boundaries extending far beyond Prosperity's current limits. "He's planning to take everything," Mason murmured. "Not just the canyon, but 20 miles in every direction." "Mason, look at this," Sarah called softly, holding up a telegram. "It's from Washington, dated 3 weeks ago." Mason took the paper, his expression darkening as he read, "Hargrove, stop Agent Buchanan arriving as scheduled. Stop necessary documentation prepared. Stop. Apache removal. Authorized pending final assessment. Stop. Generous compensation for your assistance assured. Stop. Senator Wilcox." The government agent is already compromised, Mason realized. This whole inspection is just for show. Sarah's face paled. Then the Apache never had a chance. The decision was made before Agent Buchanan even left Washington. "Money and influence," Mason said bitterly. "The same forces that have been stealing Indian land since the first white man stepped foot on this continent." "There's more," Sarah said, opening a leather-bound ledger. "Financial records showing payments to Sheriff Hayes, Judge Carlton, even the territorial governor's office." She flipped through more pages. "And here, detailed plans for the resettlement of the Apache scheduled to begin tomorrow." "Resettlement," Mason's voice hardened. "A polite word for forced removal. According to this, Hargrove has arranged for an army detachment to be conveniently nearby when—" Sarah broke off, her eyes widening in horror. "When the unfortunate incident occurs during today's welcoming ceremony." Mason looked up sharply. "What incident?" "It doesn't say specifically, but there are notes about creating a clear demonstration of the Apache threat that will justify immediate military intervention." She closed the ledger, her hands trembling slightly. "He's planning to stage an attack, isn't he?" Before Mason could respond, the office door swung fully open. Sheriff William Hayes stood in the doorway, revolver drawn, and aimed squarely at Mason's chest. Behind him stood 2 deputies, their rifles at the ready. "Hello, Ghost," Hayes said, using Mason's old war nickname. The scar on his cheek seemed to stand out more prominently as his mouth twisted in a grim smile. "Been a long time since Cold Harbor." Mason didn't move toward his weapon. "Hayes, still fighting a war that ended 12 years ago." "Some wars never end," Hayes replied, stepping into the office. "Just change battlefields." His eyes flicked to Sarah. "Miss Fleming, your father was a decent man. Shame he couldn't mind his own business." Sarah's eyes flashed. "My father was trying to save this town from men like Hargrove and you." "This isn't about the war," Mason said. "This is about Hargrove buying your badge and your conscience." Something like regret flickered across Hayes's face. "You think it's that simple? Hargrove owns this town, the businesses, the land, even the water rights. Cross him, and prosperity dies." He gestured toward the window. 300 people who depend on the mill, the commerce, the stability Hargrove provides. Tell them their town was built on stolen land and Apache blood," Mason countered. "Tell them their children will drink poisoned water once Hargrove's mining operations contaminate the underground springs." Hayes's jaw tightened. "Always the righteous one, weren't you, Blackwood? Even at Cold Harbor, when you cut down my men like wheat, you had that same damn look like God himself guided your hand." "I was a soldier following orders," Mason replied quietly. "Just like you." "Drop your gun belt, Blackwood," Hayes ordered. You and Miss Fleming are coming with me." He turned to his deputies. "Search them, then bring them to the jail. Hargrove wants them secure before the train arrives." As one deputy moved forward to disarm Mason, a tremendous explosion rocked the building, sending tremors through the floor. Outside, shouts and screams erupted from the mill yard. Hayes staggered, momentarily distracted. "What the hell was that?" Mason seized the opportunity, driving his shoulder into the nearest deputy while simultaneously drawing his revolver. The second deputy fired his shot, going wide, as Mason slammed him against the bookcase. Hayes recovered quickly, firing at Mason, but missing as Sarah flung a heavy paperweight that struck the sheriff's arm. In the chaos, Mason grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the back staircase. Behind them, Hayes shouted for his men to pursue, his voice nearly drowned out by the continuing commotion from outside. They burst through the delivery door into a scene of mayhem. A portion of the mill's ore processing section was ablaze, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. Workers ran in all directions, some carrying buckets, others simply fleeing the danger. The miners, Sarah realized. They weren't supposed to create a distraction until the train arrived. "Change of plans," Mason said grimly, pulling her behind a stack of lumber as Hayes and his deputies emerged. "Works in our favor. Let's go." They used the confusion to make their way toward the edge of the mill yard, keeping low and using the panicked workers as cover. Gunfire erupted sporadically as Hayes's men attempted to maintain order while searching for the escaped prisoners. "We need to warn Cooper and the others," Sarah said, as they crouched behind a water trough. "If Hargrove's planning violence at the ceremony, they could be walking into a trap." Mason nodded, scanning the chaos for a path to safety. "The church is 3 blocks from here. If we can reach it without being seen—" A bullet splintered the wood beside Mason's head, forcing them to duck lower. Hayes had spotted them and was closing in, his expression murderous. 2 more deputies joined him, cutting off the direct route to the church. "This way," Mason urged, leading Sarah toward a narrow alley between storage sheds. They sprinted through, emerging onto a side street lined with miners' shanties. St. Thomas Church stood slightly apart from the town's commercial district. As they approached from the rear, Mason noted with concern that the building appeared deserted. "Something's wrong," he murmured. "There should be someone watching." They entered cautiously through the back door, finding the nave empty and silent. Sunlight filtered through simple stained glass, casting colored patterns across empty pews. "Cooper," Mason called softly. "Chief." No response. Sarah pointed to the narrow staircase leading to the bell tower. "Maybe they're still hiding up there." Mason climbed the stairs swiftly, revolver drawn, but the tower was empty, save for pigeons that scattered at his approach. No sign of Cooper or Gray Eagle. "They're gone," he reported as he descended. "Either they never made it here or they left for some reason." Before Sarah could respond, the church door opened. Both turned, weapons ready, only to lower them when Dr. Sullivan stepped inside, her medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. "Thank God you're alive," she said, hurrying toward them. "The explosion at the mill, I feared the worst." "Where are Cooper and Gray Eagle?" Mason demanded. Sullivan's face was grave. "Hayes arrested Cooper an hour ago. Caught him trying to reach the church. Gray Eagle escaped, but I don't know where he went." She set her bag on a pew. "The town's in chaos. Hargrove's telling everyone the explosion was set by Apache raiders as a prelude to a larger attack." "It's a setup," Sarah explained, showing Sullivan the ledger. "Hargrove's orchestrating everything to justify seizing Apache land. The government agent arriving today is already in his pocket." Sullivan's expression hardened. "I suspected as much." She opened her medical bag, revealing the documents she had concealed earlier. "I've been trying to reach the telegraph office to send a message to the territorial governor, but Hayes has it guarded. "Where are they holding Cooper?" Mason asked. "The jail, I assume, but it'll be heavily guarded, especially now." Mason paced the narrow aisle, his mind racing. The train arrives in less than an hour. If Hargrove's planning violence during the welcoming ceremony, we need to stop it. How many men does he have? "At least 20 deputies, plus his private security," Sullivan replied. "And he's arming townspeople claiming it's for defense. We're outnumbered and outgunned," Mason acknowledged. "But we have two advantages. We know his plan, and he doesn't know we have proof of his conspiracy." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the church windows, they could see townspeople hurrying toward the train station, many carrying rifles or shotguns. "The train must be approaching," Sullivan said. "We're running out of time." Mason made a swift decision. "Sullivan, take Sarah and the documents. Use the confusion at the station to get as close to the government agent as possible. I'll create a distraction to keep Hayes and his deputies occupied." "What kind of distraction?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. "I'm going to free Cooper," Mason replied. "A jailbreak should draw plenty of attention." "That's suicide," Sullivan protested. "The jail will be the most heavily guarded building in town." "Not with the train arriving," Mason countered. "Hayes will have his best men at the station." Sarah stepped closer to Mason, her eyes searching his. "This isn't Gettysburg," she said softly. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself to atone for the past." Mason's weathered face softened momentarily. "This isn't about atonement. It's about doing what's right here and now." He checked his revolver, ensuring each chamber was loaded. "Get those documents to someone who can act on them. If I don't make it to the station, don't wait for me." Before either woman could object further, the church door burst open. A young miner, his face streaked with soot, staggered in. "Doc Sullivan," he gasped. "Come quick. They've shot Chief Gray Eagle." Dr. Eleanor Sullivan had seen many wounds in her years of frontier practice, but the sight of Chief Gray Eagle still shook her. The elderly Apache leader lay on a table in her clinic, his breathing shallow, a bullet wound in his chest, seeping blood despite her best efforts. "Will he live?" Sarah asked quietly, pressing clean bandages to the wound as Sullivan had instructed. "If we get the bleeding stopped, maybe," Sullivan replied, her voice clinical, but her eyes betraying deeper concern. "The bullet missed his heart, but it may have nicked a lung." Outside, the locomotive's whistle sounded again, closer now. The train would arrive within minutes. Gray Eagle's eyes flickered open, surprisingly clear, despite his injury. He spoke softly in Apache, then switched to English when he saw Sarah. "The ghost, my son. Mason's gone to free Cooper from the jail," Sarah explained, taking the chief's weathered hand. "They'll meet us at the station." Gray Eagle nodded, slightly wincing. "Hargrove has many guns, paid men, waiting in the hills." Sullivan looked up sharply. "What men? Where?" "North Ridge, above town," the chief managed. "Saw them, positioning rifles, not Apache. White men dressed as Apache." Tra and Sullivan exchanged alarmed glances. "The demonstration Hargrove planned," Sarah realized. "He's going to stage an Apache attack during the welcoming ceremony." "With real casualties," Sullivan added grimly. "Nothing convinces like actual bodies." "We need to warn Mason and the others," Sarah said urgently. "No time," Gray Eagle whispered. "Train comes now." With visible effort, he grasped Sarah's wrist. "Help me. Stand. Must be seen." "You can't possibly walk," Sullivan protested. "The bleeding will start again." "Must," the chief insisted. "My people Depend on it. His dark eyes, though pained, held iron determination. Better to die, standing for truth, than live, kneeling to lies. The town jail was a squat adobe structure with small barred windows and a heavy wooden door. As Mason approached from the alley behind the gunsmith shop, he noted only 2 deputies on guard, one at the front entrance and one patrolling the perimeter. Mason circled to observe the rear. A small window, barred but unguarded, provided a view into the cells. Cooper sat on a wooden bench, his hands bound a bruise darkening his cheek. In the office area beyond, a single deputy leaned back in a chair rifle across his lap. 3 men to deal with possibly a 4th inside that he couldn't see. Not impossible odds, but he would need a distraction. Mason gathered dry brush and scraps of wood, piling them against an empty storage shed adjacent to the jail. From his pocket, he took a match and struck it. The dry material caught quickly, smoke beginning to rise as flames licked at the weathered wood. Moving to the opposite side of the jail, Mason waited. Within minutes, shouts of "Fire!" echoed down the street. The deputy patrolling the perimeter ran toward the growing blaze, followed soon after by the man guarding the front door. Mason didn't waste the opportunity. He slipped inside, revolver drawn. The remaining deputy looked up in surprise from his desk, reaching for his shotgun. Mason crossed the room in 2 strides, bringing the butt of his revolver down on the man's temple before he could raise an alarm. "Ghost!" Cooper called from his cell, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here? Thought you might appreciate a change of scenery," Mason replied dryly, searching the unconscious deputy for keys. Finding them in the man's vest pocket, he quickly unlocked Cooper's cell. "Where's Hayes?" "Gone to the station to meet the train," Cooper replied as Mason freed his hands. "But not before he told me their plans for my father." Mason looked up sharply. "Gray Eagle's been shot. We just got word at the church." Cooper's expression hardened. "Hargrove's men ambushed him near the creek, claimed he was leading a war party." He took the unconscious deputy's revolver, checking its load. "My father was alone, trying to warn our people about Hargrove's scheme." "Is he dead?" "I don't know," Cooper replied, his voice tight. "Hayes said he was being treated by one of Hargrove's men, but I heard them talking about a demonstration planned for the ceremony." Mason's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. "They're going to display him as proof of the Apache threat. Wounded or dead, he'll be their exhibit to justify military action." A noise from outside alerted them the deputies were returning, having discovered the fire was a diversion. Mason and Cooper moved quickly to the rear door, slipping out just as shouts erupted from the front of the jail. "This way," Cooper urged, leading Mason through a maze of narrow passages between buildings. "There's another entrance to the tunnels behind the blacksmith shop." Gunfire erupted behind them. The deputies had discovered their prisoner's escape. Bullets whined overhead, splintering wood and ricocheting off stone walls. "The whole town will be alerted now," Mason said as they ducked into an abandoned shed. "Hayes will send men to protect Hargrove and the ceremony." Cooper checked the load in his revolver. "Then we go directly to the source. Where's Sarah?" "With Sullivan trying to reach the government agent at the station." A whistle sounded in the distance, the train approaching Prosperity. "We're out of time," Cooper said grimly. "Hargrove will make his move once the official welcome begins." His eyes met Mason's determination, replacing fear. "My father once told me that a warrior faces death with open eyes. I think it's time we both stopped running from our ghosts. Don't you?" Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the burden of Gettysburg, of 15 years of self-imposed exile from his own courage. "I reckon it is." The Prosperity train station had been transformed. Colorful bunting decorated the newly constructed platform, and a brass band played a somewhat uneven rendition of patriotic tunes. Nearly the entire town had gathered, eager to witness the moment Prosperity officially joined the expanding network of rail connecting east to west. Victor Hargrove stood at the center of the platform, resplendent in an expensive Eastern suit. Beside him, Sheriff Hayes maintained a vigilant watch, his hand never straying far from his revolver. A dozen deputies were positioned strategically throughout the area, scanning for signs of Mason Blackwood. From their position behind the water tower, Mason and Cooper observed the scene. "There's Hayes," Cooper noted, "and at least 10 deputies I can see." Mason's eyes weren't on the lawmen, but on the ridgeline north of town. "Up there," he said quietly, pointing to a rocky outcropping. "Movement among the rocks. Riflemen." Cooper followed his gaze. "Not Apache. My people wouldn't choose such obvious positions." "Hargrove's men dressed to look like Apache warriors," Mason agreed. "They'll wait until the ceremony is underway, then open fire. Enough casualties to justify immediate military action, but not so many as to scare off potential investors." "Cold calculation," Cooper said bitterly. "White men's math. How many Indian lives equal an ounce of gold?" The train whistle sounded once more, much closer now. Mason scanned the gathering, searching for Sarah and Sullivan, but saw no sign of them. "We need to warn them," he said. "If we could reach the telegraph office." "Too late," Cooper interrupted, pointing to the approaching locomotive. "The train's here." Mason made a swift decision. "I'll try to reach Hargrove and the agent. You get to those riflemen on the ridge. Even if you can just disrupt their timing, it might give us the opening we need." Cooper nodded, clasping Mason's arm briefly. "Good hunting, Ghost." As Cooper slipped away, Mason moved through the crowd, keeping his hat low. The train pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and squealing of brakes. The crowd cheered as it came to a stop, the locomotive's brass fittings gleaming in the midday sun. Hargrove stepped forward as a distinguished-looking man in his 50s descended from the train wearing a black suit and carrying a leather portfolio, Agent Buchanan, presumably. He was followed by several other well-dressed men, likely investors. Mason had almost reached the edge of the platform when he spotted Sarah and Sullivan approaching from the direction of the clinic. Between them, supported, but walking under his own power, was Chief Gray Eagle. A murmur ran through the crowd at the sight of the wounded Apache leader. Hargrove's smooth facade cracked momentarily. He leaned over to whisper something to Hayes, who immediately signaled to his deputies. Mason changed direction, moving to intercept Sarah and Sullivan before Hayes's men could reach them. He broke through the crowd just as 2 deputies approached the trio from the opposite direction. "Sullivan," Mason called, "get down! There are riflemen on the ridge." His warning came just as the first shot rang out from the northern hills. The crowd erupted in panic as more shots followed, bullets striking the platform and sending splinters flying. People scattered, screaming and running for cover. "Apache attack!" someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by others. In the chaos, Mason reached Sarah and the others, helping to support Gray Eagle. "This way," he urged, guiding them toward the shelter of the station building. Hayes and his deputies had drawn their weapons, firing toward the ridge. Hargrove, meanwhile, had ushered Agent Buchanan and the investors into the station's private office, ostensibly for safety. "We need to reach them," Sarah insisted, clutching her satchel of evidence, "before Hargrove convinces them this is an actual Apache attack." Another volley of shots rang out, but Mason noticed something odd. The bullets were striking well away from the crowd, now kicking up dust, but causing no injuries. He smiled grimly. "Cooper's reached the riflemen. He's disrupting their aim." Taking advantage of the confusion, Mason led their group around to the station's side entrance. Through the window, they could see Hargrove gesturing emphatically to Buchanan and the others, his expression appropriately grave and concerned. They entered without knocking. Hargrove turned his practiced smile freezing as he registered their presence. Hayes was absent still outside, directing the response to the attack. "What is the meaning of this?" Buchanan demanded, looking from Hargrove to the newcomers with confusion. "The meaning, sir," Sarah said, stepping forward with her father's documents, "is that you're witnessing a carefully orchestrated deception. There is no Apache attack. Those are Mr. Hargrove's hired men firing deliberately wide to create panic and justify the seizure of Apache lands." Hargrove's composure returned quickly. "Agent Buchanan, this young woman is Sarah Fleming, daughter of our former railroad engineer. I'm afraid she's been mentally unstable since her father's tragic accident. As for Blackwood," he nodded toward Mason, "he's a known recluse with a history of violent outbursts." "That's a lie," Mason said calmly. "And we can prove it." He nodded to Sarah, who opened her satchel and withdrew the telegram they had found in Hargrove's office. "This telegram," she said, handing it to Buchanan, "indicates that you and Mr. Hargrove had an arrangement regarding Apache removal before you even left Washington. And these," she produced more documents, "show how Mr. Hargrove has systematically falsified land claims, bribed officials, and now orchestrated violence to justify theft of Apache territory." Gray Eagle, despite his wound, drew himself up with dignity. "I have lived 70 winters," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Seen white men come with many promises, many papers. Always the same end: our land taken, our people moved, our ways dying." He fixed Hargrove with a penetrating stare. "But never before have I seen a man create war from nothing, paint his own men as enemies, spill blood for yellow metal in the ground." The room fell silent. Outside, the gunfire had ceased, replaced by shouted orders as Hayes and his deputies organized a pursuit of the supposed attackers. Buchanan cleared his throat. "Chief, are you suggesting that Mr. Hargrove staged this attack?" "Not suggesting," Sullivan interjected, opening her medical bag. "Proving." She withdrew a bullet she had extracted from Gray Eagle's wound. This is a standard .44 caliber round from a Winchester rifle, the same model Hargrove's security force carries. Not the type of ammunition used by Apache warriors." The door burst open, and Sheriff Hayes entered, his face flushed with exertion and anger. He stopped short at the tableau before him. "Sheriff," Hargrove said smoothly, "arrest these trespassers immediately." Hayes's hand moved to his revolver, but his eyes were fixed on the documents spread across the table. The evidence of corruption and planned violence laid bare. For a long moment, he stood frozen between duty and conscience. "Sheriff Hayes," Mason said quietly, "you once told me that some wars never end, they just change battlefields. This isn't Cold Harbor anymore. This is about right and wrong here and now." Hayes's gaze shifted to Gray Eagle, noting the blood-stained bandages. "You shot an unarmed man," he said to Hargrove, his voice hardening. "Staged an attack on your own town." "Oh, don't be ridiculous," Hargrove scoffed, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. "These people have filled your head with lies. Remember who pays your salary, Hayes." "I remember who I swore an oath to," Hayes replied, his hand moving from his revolver to his badge. "And it wasn't you." Hargrove's mask of civility dissolved entirely. With surprising speed, He drew a small derringer from his coat pocket, aiming it directly at Sarah. "I've spent 20 years building my empire," he snarled. "I won't let it be destroyed by a meddling girl and a washed-up soldier." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Drop the documents, or she dies first." Time seemed to slow as Mason assessed the situation. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, placing himself between Sarah and the gun. The derringer's report was deafening in the confined space. Mason felt the bullet's impact, like a hammer blow to his chest, driving the air from his lungs and sending him staggering backward. Through a haze of pain, he saw Hayes draw and fire in one fluid motion. Hargrove spun and collapsed, the derringer falling from his hand. Then darkness closed around Mason's vision, and he knew no more. Sarah's scream echoed in the sudden silence, a cry of anguish that seemed to stretch beyond the station walls and across the canyon lands, carrying with it 15 years of ghosts finally laid to rest. Sarah's hands trembled as she pressed a folded cloth against Mason's chest, trying to stem the flow of blood that stained his shirt crimson. The room had erupted into chaos after Hayes shot Hargrove, investors shouting questions, Buchanan calling for order, deputies rushing in with weapons drawn. But for Sarah, the world had narrowed to the pale face of the man who had just saved her life. "Mason, stay with me," she whispered fiercely. "You don't get to die now, not when we've come this far." Dr. Sullivan knelt beside them, her experienced fingers working swiftly to assess the wound. "The bullet's lodged near his collarbone," she reported, her voice professionally detached, despite the concern in her eyes. "It's missed his heart, but he's losing blood fast." Hayes holstered his smoking revolver and took charge of the room, ordering his deputies to secure Hargrove's unconscious form and clear the office of onlookers. Only Buchanan remained, his face ashen as he clutched the incriminating documents Sarah had provided. "I need to get him to my clinic," Sullivan insisted. "Every minute counts." Hayes nodded, directing two of his men to carefully lift Mason. "Take the back way," he instructed. "The main street's still in chaos from the shooting." As they carried Mason's limp form through the door, Sarah gathered the scattered evidence with shaking hands. The documents, her father's legacy, and the key to justice for the Apache, seemed suddenly less important than the life bleeding away before her eyes. "He'll make it," Gray Eagle said softly, his own wound seemingly forgotten as he watched Mason being carried out. "The ghost has walked with death before. It is not yet his time to cross over." Sarah wished she could share the chief's confidence. In the brief time she'd known Mason Blackwood, she'd glimpsed a man of exceptional courage and integrity beneath the hard exterior he presented to the world. A man still haunted by his past, still seeking redemption. To lose him now, just as he'd found his way back to the man he once was. "Agent Buchanan," she said, turning to the government representative with renewed determination. "Those men on the ridge were Hargrove's employees dressed as Apache to justify a military response. Cooper Chief Gray Eagle's son should have reached them by now. We need to send men to bring them in as witnesses." Buchanan, still visibly shaken by the violence and the revelations of corruption involving his own name, hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Sheriff Hayes, can you spare some men for this task?" Hayes, who had been conferring with his deputy at the door, straightened up. The inner conflict that had plagued him was gone, replaced by the resolute demeanor of a lawman who had finally remembered his true duty. "Johnson," he called to a deputy, "take 4 men and head to the North Ridge. Approach with caution. Cooper may have the situation under control, but those hired guns might resist capture." He turned back to Buchanan. "Meanwhile, sir, I suggest we secure these documents and send an immediate telegraph to the territorial governor. This goes beyond local jurisdiction." Sarah felt a flicker of hope amid her fear for Mason. Hayes's transformation from Hargrove's enforcer to advocate for justice might just turn the tide in their favor. But as she followed the men carrying Mason toward Sullivan's clinic, she knew the battle was far from over. Hargrove had built his empire on more than just bribery and intimidation. He had powerful allies in territorial government and Eastern business circles. The evidence they'd gathered might not be enough to ensure justice prevailed. And even if it did, what price had already been paid, Mason's life hanging by a thread. Cooper risking himself on the ridge. Gray Eagle wounded and his people still in danger. Her own father, whose pursuit of truth had cost him everything. The weight of it all threatened to crush her spirit as she hurried through Prosperity's back alleys, away from the confusion still gripping the main street. But with each step, Sarah Fleming made a silent vow to see this through to the end, whatever the cost. She owed it to her father, to the Apache, to Mason, and to herself. Sullivan's clinic was a modest two-story building near the edge of town, its whitewashed walls and green shutters a familiar sight to the people of Prosperity. Inside, the main room had been hastily converted into an operating theater. Mason lay unconscious on a table, his shirt cut away to reveal the ugly wound in his upper chest. Sullivan worked with quiet efficiency, her hands steady as she prepared instruments and medicines. "Sarah, I need you to assist," the doctor said, not looking up from her work. "There's a clean apron on the hook. Wash your hands thoroughly at the basin, then come hold this lamp so I can see properly." The practical tasks helped calm Sarah's racing mind. As she positioned the lamp to illuminate Mason's wound, Sullivan began the delicate process of extracting the bullet and repairing the damage it had caused. "Is he going to survive?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the question contained any longer. Sullivan's eyes remained focused on her patient. "If infection doesn't set in, and if the bullet hasn't caused damage, I can't see he has a good chance. Mason Blackwood is one of the toughest men I've ever treated, and I've treated my share of frontiersmen and soldiers." A commotion outside interrupted them, the sound of multiple horses arriving, followed by voices raised in argument. Sullivan cursed under her breath. "See who that is," she instructed Sarah. "I can't leave him now." Sarah set down the lamp and moved to the window, carefully peering through the curtains. Cooper had returned, accompanied by 3 men whose hands were bound behind their backs. Hayes and several deputies surrounded them, while a small crowd of townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual sight. She hurried outside to meet them. Cooper's face was grim but satisfied as he dismounted his rifle, still trained on the captives. "Found these 3 on the ridge," he reported. 2 more ran when they saw me coming. These decided surrender was preferable to taking their chances in Apache territory. And the captured men looked like typical hired guns, rough, weather-beaten faces, expensive rifles, and the sullen demeanor of men who killed for money rather than cause. One of them, older than the others, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, spat on the ground. "We was just following orders," he growled. "Hargrove paid us to fire over people's heads, make it look like an Indian attack. Wasn't supposed to be no real killing." "Tell that to my father," Cooper replied coldly, gesturing toward the clinic where Gray Eagle was resting. "The bullet in his chest might disagree with your version of events." Hayes stepped forward. "You'll have your chance to testify, all of you. For now, you're under arrest for conspiracy assault and attempted murder." He nodded to his deputies. "Get them to the jail. Double Guard Hargrove still has friends in town who might try to silence them." As the prisoners were led away, Sarah pulled Cooper aside. "Mason's been shot," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He stepped in front of a bullet Hargrove meant for me." Cooper's expression darkened further. "How bad?" Dr. Sullivan's removing the bullet now. She says if infection doesn't set in, she couldn't finish the sentence. Cooper placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Ghost is stronger than he looks, and he's finally found something worth living for. He won't give that up easily. Before Sarah could respond, Agent Buchanan approached, looking considerably more composed than he had in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore the serious expression of a man confronting uncomfortable truths. "Miss Fleming, Mr. Cooper," he greeted them with a formal nod. "I've reviewed the documents you provided along with Mr. Hargrove's records that Sheriff Hayes has since secured. The evidence of conspiracy and fraud is substantial." "And your own involvement?" Cooper asked bluntly. "The telegram mentioned you by name, Agent Buchanan." A flush crept up the government man's neck. "I was led to believe this was a routine inspection to facilitate economic development in the territory. Senator Wilcox assured me the Apache situation had been legally resolved through proper treaties." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I did not inquire too deeply into the particulars." "Convenient," Cooper observed. "Be that as it may," Buchanan continued stiffly, "I am now fully aware of the actual circumstances. I've sent telegrams to the territorial governor and to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington outlining Hargrove's scheme and recommending immediate intervention to protect Apache lands and water rights." Sarah studied the agent's face, trying to gauge his sincerity. Men like Buchanan, career bureaucrats with political ambitions, were skilled at adjusting their positions to align with changing winds. Still, his actions now mattered more than his previous failings. "What about the investors?" she asked. "The men who came on the train with you. They've withdrawn all consideration of partnership with Hargrove's enterprises," Buchanan replied. "No businessman wants his name associated with such notorious methods, especially once it becomes public knowledge." A small victory, Sarah thought, but a significant one. Without Eastern capital, Hargrove's plans for expansion would crumble, even if he somehow escaped legal consequences for his actions. "And the army detachment Hargrove arranged to have nearby," Cooper pressed. "I've sent word to their commander explaining the situation," Buchanan assured him. "They will not be taking any action against the Apache settlements." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Sullivan emerging from the clinic, wiping her hands on a blood-stained cloth. Her face was drawn with fatigue, but there was relief in her eyes. "I've removed the bullet," she announced. "The wound is clean, and I've stitched it closed. He's lost a lot of blood, but if we can prevent infection, he should recover." Sarah felt her knees weaken with relief. Cooper steadied her with a supportive hand, his own tension visibly easing at the news. "When will he regain consciousness?" she asked. "Hard to say," Sullivan replied. "I've given him laudanum for the pain. Could be hours, could be tomorrow. The important thing now is rest and careful monitoring." Sarah nodded determination, replacing her fear. "I'll stay with him." "And I'll check on my father," Cooper added. "Then I need to return to our people. They should know what's happened and that the threat isn't over yet." "What do you mean?" Buchanan asked, frowning. "Hargrove has been stopped. His plan exposed." Cooper's expression was grim. "Hargrove may be finished, but the gold and water in Eagle Canyon remain. Other men will come with other schemes. Our fight is just beginning." The truth of his words settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. Today's victory, if it could be called that, with Mason lying wounded and the future still uncertain, was merely the first battle in a longer war. The railroad would still come. Prosperity would still grow. The pressure on Apache lands would only increase with time. As if reading her thoughts, Buchanan cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Fleming, your father's alternate northern route for the railroad, the one that would preserve Apache territory while still serving Prosperity's needs. I'd like to review those plans in detail. Perhaps a compromise could be reached that serves all interests. A seed of hope, small but resilient. Sarah nodded. I'll provide you with everything my father documented, but any agreement must guarantee Apache water rights in perpetuity, not just until the next gold strike or copper discovery makes those promises inconvenient. Of course, Buchanan agreed, though his slight hesitation revealed the political calculations already running through his mind. As the men departed Cooper to check on his father, Buchanan, to continue his investigations, Hayes, to secure the town, Sarah returned to Mason's bedside. His face was pale, his breathing shallow but steady. She pulled a chair close and took his hand in hers, its roughness telling the story of a hard life lived in harsh country. You don't get to leave now, Captain Blackwood, she whispered. Not when we've only just begun. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across Prosperity shadows that concealed as much as they revealed in a town whose foundations had been shaken to their core. Mason drifted through darkness, occasionally surfacing into hazy consciousness, only to sink back into fevered dreams. Battlefield smoke swirled around him, the cries of wounded men at Gettysburg blending with the crack of Hargrove's Derringer and Sarah's desperate voice calling his name. Through it all, a persistent pain anchored him to reality, a burning in his chest that neither sleep nor laudanum could fully extinguish. When he finally opened his eyes, with clear awareness, pale morning light was filtering through muslin curtains. He lay in an unfamiliar bed, his chest heavily bandaged, a wool blanket pulled up to his waist. The room was small but neat, with a dresser washstand, and the chair where Sarah Fleming sat sleeping, her head resting at an awkward angle that promised a stiff neck upon waking. Mason tried to speak, but his throat was dry as Arizona dust. He managed only a raspy cough, which was enough to startle Sarah awake. Her eyes, momentarily confused with sleep, widened with recognition and relief. "Mason," she breathed immediately, reaching for a cup of water on the nightstand. She helped him raise his head enough to drink, her hand steady despite her obvious fatigue. "Dr. Sullivan said you'd wake today. Your fever broke during the night." The cool water was salvation on his parched throat. After several careful sips, Mason found his voice. "Hargrove." "Alive but in custody," Sarah replied. "Hayes shot him in the shoulder after you went down. He's under guard at the jail facing charges of conspiracy fraud and attempted murder." Mason's mind was still piecing together the fragments of memory from before he lost consciousness. The Apache Cooper. Safe for now, Cooper returned to the settlement 2 days ago to reassure his people and bring them news. She hesitated. "Chief Gray Eagle is here recovering in the next room. His wound was serious but not fatal." 2 days. Mason attempted to sit up immediately, regretting the movement as pain lanced through his chest. "Don't try to move," Sarah admonished gently, pressing him back against the pillows. "Dr. Sullivan said you're lucky to be alive. The bullet missed your heart by less than an inch." Mason closed his eyes briefly, the full weight of recent events settling upon him. "The government agent, Buchanan. What's happened with him?" Sarah's expression was guarded. "He sent reports to his superiors about Hargrove's activities, claims he was unaware of the full scope of the conspiracy." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture Mason had come to recognize as a sign of her weighing her words carefully. "He's reviewing my father's plans for the Northern Railroad route, considering a compromise that would protect Apache lands." "You don't trust him," Mason observed. "I trust that he'll do whatever benefits his career," she replied frankly. Right now, with Hargrove exposed and witnesses to the staged attack, that means appearing to champion justice for the Apache. Whether that commitment lasts once the scandal fades, she shrugged. Time will tell. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Sullivan entered, her professional demeanor lightening at the sight of Mason awake and alert. "Well, look who's decided to rejoin the land of the living," she said, approaching the bed and pressing a cool hand to his forehead. "No fever. Good. Let's have a look at that wound." As Sullivan carefully removed the bandages to examine the injury, Mason studied Sarah more closely. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes were wrinkled from what had clearly been several nights of keeping vigil at his bedside. Despite her exhaustion, there was a quiet strength in her bearing that reminded him of battlefield nurses he'd known during the war, women who had witnessed the worst of humanity, yet somehow maintained their compassion and resolve. "The wound is healing nicely," Sullivan announced after her inspection. "No signs of infection." "You're an extraordinarily lucky man, Captain Blackwood." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Mason replied. "I had a good doctor." Sullivan's mouth quirked in a half-smile as she applied fresh bandages. "Flattery won't get you out of bed any sooner. You've lost a significant amount of blood, and your body needs time to recover. I'm prescribing at least another week of complete rest." "A week?" Mason protested. "Doc, I can't." "You can, and you will." Sullivan cut him off firmly. "Unless you prefer to undo all my fine needlework and start bleeding internally again." Before Mason could argue further, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, followed by a sharp knock. Sheriff Hayes entered, without waiting for a response, his expression grave. "Doc, Miss Fleming," he greeted them with a nod before turning his attention to Mason. "Good to see you awake, Blackwood. Wasn't sure you'd pull through." "Sorry to disappoint," Mason replied dryly. Hayes's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "We need to talk. Alone," he added, glancing at Sarah and Sullivan. The two women exchanged looks before Sullivan nodded reluctantly. "5 minutes, Sheriff. My patient needs rest." After they left, closing the door behind them, Hayes removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. The gesture revealed a man under considerable strain, the lines in his face deeper than Mason remembered. "Town's on edge," Hayes began without preamble. "Hargrove's supporters are claiming he's been framed, that the whole Apache attack was real, and we've arrested the wrong man." He moved to the window, glancing out at the street below. Meanwhile, the miners and small ranchers who've suffered under Hargrove's schemes are calling for immediate justice, the kind that comes from a rope, not a trial. "And where do you stand?" Mason asked, studying his former enemy carefully. Hayes turned back to face him, his expression hardening. "I stand with the law. Hargrove will face proper justice for his crimes, not mob vengeance." He paused. "But that's not why I'm here." "Then why?" "Because Hargrove's influence extends beyond prosperity," Hayes explained. "This morning I received a telegram from Judge Carlton in Tucson. He's ordering Hargrove transferred to his jurisdiction immediately, citing concerns about the defendant receiving a fair trial locally." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Carlton's on Hargrove's payroll. We saw the ledgers." "Exactly," Hayes agreed grimly. "If Hargrove reaches Tucson, Carlton will dismiss the charges, destroy the evidence, and release him within hours. And there's not a damn thing I can legally do about it." The implications were clear. After everything they had risked and suffered, Hargrove might still escape justice through the very system he had corrupted. "When is the transfer ordered?" Mason asked. "Tomorrow morning. I'm to escort him personally to meet the eastbound train at 9 o'clock. Hayes replaced his hat, adjusting it with practiced precision. "Thought you should know, considering you nearly died bringing him down." As Hayes turned to leave, Mason called after him. "Sheriff, why the change of heart? You could have sided with Hargrove at the station. You didn't." Hayes paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "During the war, after you captured me at Cold Harbor, you could have left me to die from my wounds. Instead, you ensured I received medical attention before sending me to the prisoner camp." His fingers traced the scar on his cheek unconsciously. "I've carried that debt for 12 years. Figured it was time to pay it." With that he departed, leaving Mason alone with troubling news and painful memories. If Hargrove escaped to Tucson, everything they had accomplished would unravel. The Apache would lose their land, Sarah's father would have died in vain, and Mason's own redemption would remain incomplete. But in his current condition, what could he possibly do to prevent it? The door opened again, and Sarah re-entered her expression, making it clear she had overheard at least part of Hayes's news. "Judge Carlton is corrupt," she said without preamble. "My father documented payments from Hargrove to him dating back 3 years. Evidence that will conveniently disappear if Hargrove reaches Tucson," Mason agreed. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her nearness sending an unexpected warmth through Mason that had nothing to do with his injury. "We can't let that happen," she said firmly. "Not after everything it's cost us." Her eyes traveled to his bandaged chest, and for a moment her composure cracked, revealing the fear and exhaustion she had been holding at bay. "I almost lost you." The naked emotion in her voice caught Mason off guard. In the short time they had known each other, a connection had formed between them, forged in danger and strengthened by shared purpose. But until this moment, he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge how deeply that connection had taken root. "We'll find a way," he promised, covering her hand with his. "But not by breaking the law. Hayes is right about one thing: justice has to come through proper channels, or it's no better than vengeance." Sarah's fingers intertwined with his, their warmth a stark contrast to the cool morning air. "Agent Buchanan," she said suddenly, "he has the authority to countermand Judge Carlton's order. If we can convince him that Hargrove's trial must happen here where the witnesses and evidence are readily available." "It's worth trying," Mason agreed. "But Buchanan strikes me as a man who avoids risk when possible. He'll need compelling motivation to challenge a territorial judge." A determined light entered Sarah's eyes, the same light Mason had seen when she first showed him her father's documents at his cabin, which now seemed a lifetime ago. "Then we'll give him motivation," she said. "Evidence so compelling and witnesses so credible that allowing Hargrove's transfer would amount to obvious obstruction of justice." Before Mason could respond, the floor beneath them trembled slightly, followed by the distant but unmistakable sound of an explosion. Sarah rushed to the window, Mason struggling to sit up despite the pain in his chest. "The mine," Sarah gasped, pointing to a plume of black smoke rising from the direction of Hargrove's stamp mill. "Something's happened at the mine." Sullivan burst into the room, her face pale. "There's been an explosion at the main shaft. They're saying dozens of miners are trapped." She grabbed her medical bag from beside the door. "I have to go. Sarah, stay with Mason and Chief Gray Eagle. I'll send word when I can." As the doctor hurried out, Sarah turned back to Mason, her expression a mixture of concern and suspicion. "This is too convenient," she said. "An explosion now, when everyone's attention is on Hargrove's case." Mason's thoughts exactly. "A distraction," he agreed. "Or worse, an opportunity." With effort, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, fighting against the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. Sarah was at his side immediately. "What are you doing?" "You heard Dr. Sullivan. You need rest." "What I need," Mason countered, gritting his teeth against the pain, "is to make sure Hargrove doesn't use this chaos to escape. Help me up." Sarah hesitated clearly, torn between concern for his health and recognition of the threat. Finally, she nodded, supporting his weight as he carefully stood. "My clothes?" "In the wardrobe. But Mason, you can barely stand. How do you expect to, one step at a time?" He interrupted, his voice stronger than he felt. "First, we need to check on Hayes and make sure Hargrove is still secure. Then we find Cooper and warn him that things may be coming to a head faster than we anticipated." As Sarah helped him dress, moving with gentle efficiency around his bandaged chest, Mason gazed out the window at the smoke rising over Prosperity. The explosion might be a genuine accident. Mining was dangerous work and disasters were not uncommon, but the timing raised too many questions to ignore. "Where's my gun belt?" he asked, as Sarah helped him into his shirt. She retrieved it from a drawer, the weight of the Remington still secure in its holster. "Mason, be reasonable. You're in no condition for a gunfight." "With luck, it won't come to that," he replied, though they both knew luck had been in short supply lately. By the time they were ready to leave, Mason had regained some of his strength, though each movement sent fresh pain lancing through his chest. He paused at the door of the adjacent room, where Chief Gray Eagle lay resting his weathered face, peaceful in sleep. "We should wake him," Sarah suggested. "Let him know what's happening." Mason shook his head. "Let him rest. His fight is over for now. Ours is just beginning." As they stepped out into Prosperity's main street, the scene before them was one of controlled chaos. Men ran toward the mine carrying tools and shouting instructions. Women gathered in small groups, fear evident on their faces as they awaited news of husbands and sons who had been working the morning shift. Through it all, the plume of smoke continued to rise, a dark harbinger against the clear blue sky. Mason and Sarah made their way toward the jail, moving as quickly as his injured state would allow. The usual bustle of commerce had been replaced by the single-minded focus of a community in crisis, with most attention directed toward the disaster at the mine. Few people paid attention to the wounded man and the determined young woman supporting him through the crowded streets. Just as they approached the jail, a shot rang out close and unmistakable. Then another. And another. "Inside," Mason urged, drawing his revolver despite the pain the movement caused. "Now." With Sarah at his side, he pushed through the jailhouse door into a scene of carnage that confirmed their worst fears. 2 deputies lay dead on the floor, blood pooling beneath them. The cell door stood open, its lock destroyed by gunfire. And Sheriff William Hayes sat slumped against the wall, pressing a bloodied hand against a wound in his side, his face contorted in pain and fury. "Hargrove," he managed through gritted teeth. 3 men broke him out, headed for the livery stable. Sarah rushed to Hayes's side, examining his wound, while Mason checked the fallen deputies. Both were beyond help. "How long ago?" Mason demanded. 5 minutes. Hayes gasped. "Maybe less. Said something about meeting a rider at Eagle Pass." Eagle Pass, a narrow gap in the mountains north of town, leading toward the territorial border. If Hargrove reached it, he could disappear into the vast lawless regions beyond, perhaps all the way to Mexico. "You need a doctor," Sarah told Hayes, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against his bleeding side. "No time," Hayes insisted, struggling to rise. "Need to go after them." "You'll bleed to death," Sarah countered firmly. "I'll find Dr. Sullivan." "I'll go after Hargrove," Mason decided, the pain in his chest forgotten amid the surge of adrenaline. "Sarah, get Hayes to Sullivan, then find Cooper. Tell him to meet me at Eagle Pass." Sarah's eyes met his, fear and determination warring within them. You're in no condition to face Hargrove and 3 gunmen alone. Mason checked his revolver, ensuring all chambers were loaded. I won't engage them directly. Just track them, slow them down if possible until Cooper can bring reinforcements. It was a plan born of desperation, and they both knew it. In his weakened state, Mason stood little chance against Hargrove and his men. But the alternative, allowing the architect of so much suffering to escape justice, was unacceptable. "Be careful," Sarah said softly, her hand briefly touching his cheek, in a gesture that carried more meaning than words could express. "I didn't bring you back from death's door just to lose you again." With a nod that contained his own unspoken feelings, Mason stepped back out into the street, leaving Sarah to tend to Hayes. Every step sent pain through his chest, but he pushed it aside, focused solely on reaching the livery stable before Hargrove's trail went cold. As he moved against the flow of townspeople still rushing toward the mine, Mason felt the weight of his decision. 15 years ago, he had led men into battle at Gettysburg, a decision that had cost most of them their lives. Now, once again, he was committing himself to a course of action that might well prove fatal. But this time was different. At Gettysburg, he had been following orders, leading men based on flawed intelligence and strategic miscalculations. Today he chose his path freely driven not by duty to a cause, but by personal conviction in what was right. If this was to be his last stand, Mason Blackwood would make it count. Eagle Pass cut through the northern mountains like a giant's axe, stroke its narrow walls rising sharply on either side to form a natural funnel. Anyone traveling north from Prosperity had to navigate this passage, a fact that had made it a favorite spot for ambushes since the earliest days of the Apache Wars. Mason knew the pass well. In his first years after settling near Prosperity, he had ridden through it countless times, learning its hidden approaches and concealed vantage points. Now, that knowledge might be the only advantage he possessed against Hargrove and his hired guns. He had managed to secure a horse from the livery stable, where a stable boy confirmed seeing 4 men ride out in haste less than 10 minutes earlier. The boy had thought nothing of it with the mine disaster drawing all attention. Men rushing somewhere seemed unremarkable. The pain in Mason's chest had settled into a constant burning, each hoofbeat sending fresh jolts through his wounded body. The rational part of his mind acknowledged the foolishness of his pursuit. He was one injured man against 4, with no guarantee that help would arrive in time. But deeper than reason, stronger than pain, was the certainty that this moment was what his 15 years of exile had been leading toward, a final reckoning with the man he had become and the man he might yet be. The trail was easy to follow. Hargrove and his men had ridden hard, leaving clear tracks in the dusty earth. They were making for the northern end of Eagle Pass, beyond which lay a maze of canyons and dried riverbeds that could hide a man for weeks while he made his way to the territorial border. Mason rode more cautiously, keeping to the tree line that bordered the main trail. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and he could feel fresh blood seeping through his bandages as the wound Sullivan had so carefully stitched began to reopen. He'd be fortunate to remain conscious, let alone engage in a firefight. As the southern entrance to Eagle Pass loomed before him, Mason reined in his mount and dismounted carefully, tethering the horse to a scrub oak. From here he would proceed on foot. The pass was about a half-mile long, with several twists that limited visibility. If Hargrove had posted a lookout, a mounted approach would make Mason an easy target. Drawing his Remington, he began making his way through the rocks and sparse vegetation that lined the eastern edge of the pass. Each step required conscious effort, now his body protesting against the continued exertion. But the alternative, allowing Hargrove to escape justice, drove him forward. Approximately 200 yards into the pass, Mason paused, listening intently. Voices echoed faintly from around the next bend. He dropped to a crouch, ignoring the fresh wave of pain, and moved carefully toward the sound. Peering around a large boulder, he took in the scene before him. Hargrove and 3 men had stopped in a small clearing where the pass widened briefly. Their horses were tethered to a dead tree, while the men themselves were engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Hargrove, his arm in a sling from Hayes's bullet, was gesturing emphatically with his good hand. "Should have been here by now," Mason heard him saying as he edged closer. "If that fool betrayed me—" "Maybe the explosion at the mine delayed him," suggested one of the gunmen, a tall man with a scarred face, whom Mason recognized as Jake Turner, a notorious gun-for-hire who'd worked for Hargrove in the past. "Or maybe your money doesn't spend as well as it used to," another man remarked dryly. "Word gets around about employers who lose." Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "I haven't lost Reeves. This is a strategic withdrawal. Once we reach Mexico, I'll wire my contacts in San Francisco. Within a month, I'll have the capital to return and reclaim everything." "If you say so," Reeves replied, clearly unconvinced. "But we were hired to get you to Eagle Pass to meet your contact. If he doesn't show soon, our arrangement needs renegotiation." Mason considered his options. He was outnumbered and outgunned, his physical condition deteriorating by the minute. A direct confrontation would be suicide. His best hope was to remain hidden, observe, and wait for Cooper to arrive with reinforcements. But as he shifted position to maintain his surveillance, a loose stone gave way beneath his boot, clattering down the rocky slope. The sound, magnified by the pass's acoustics, might as well have been a gunshot. "Someone's there!" shouted the third gunman, drawing his weapon and firing in Mason's direction. The bullet struck the boulder inches from his head, sending stone fragments flying. Mason ducked back as all 3 gunmen opened fire bullets, ricocheting off the rocks around him. He was pinned down, his cover rapidly being chipped away by the barrage. "It's Blackwood," Darjirval called out, recognizing Mason during a brief moment when he had been exposed. "Kill him, $1,000 to the man who puts a bullet in his heart." The gunfire intensified. Mason returned fire, sparingly conscious of his limited ammunition and the need to make each shot count. He managed to wing one of the gunmen, Reeves, he thought, sending the man scrambling for better cover with a curse. "You should have stayed dead, Blackwood," Hargrove shouted over the gunfire. "You've accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. Prosperity will be mine again, the Apache will be removed, and Sarah Fleming will wish she'd never heard her father's name." The mention of Sarah ignited something in Mason, not just anger, but a fierce protectiveness that transcended his physical pain. With renewed determination, he waited for a pause in the shooting, then risked a quick glance around the boulder. Turner had shifted position, trying to work his way around to Mason's flank. The wounded Reeves was reloading behind a fallen log, while the third gunman maintained suppressing fire from behind their horses. Hargrove himself had taken cover behind a large rock, his injured arm making him more a liability than an asset in the firefight. Mason took careful aim and fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot caught the flanking Turner in the leg, dropping him with a howl of pain. The second struck near enough to the third gunman to force him back into cover. But the effort cost Mason dearly. The recoil sent fresh agony through his chest, and he felt warm blood soaking through his shirt. "You're outnumbered and bleeding out, Ghost," Turner called, using Mason's old battlefield nickname. "Give it up, this ain't your fight." "That's where you're wrong," Mason replied, his voice carrying clearly in the pass. "This has been my fight since Gettysburg. I just didn't know it until now." A new voice suddenly echoed from further up the pass. "Drop your weapons. You're surrounded!" Cooper's voice, Mason realized with relief. And not just Cooper. At least two other voices joined in ordering Hargrove and his men to surrender. The cavalry, it seemed, had arrived just in time. But Hargrove had no intention of surrendering. With a shout to his remaining able-bodied gunmen, he made a break for the horses. Mason pivoted, took aim, and fired his last round. The bullet struck Hargrove's good shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining gunman, seeing the odds shift decisively against them, threw down his weapon. "Don't shoot! I'm done." Cooper appeared from the northern end of the pass, rifle at the ready, accompanied by two Apache warriors. At almost the same moment, Sarah and Sheriff Hayes emerged from the southern approach, Hayes moving stiffly but upright, his revolver trained on the surrendering gunmen. "Cutting it close, Cooper," Mason observed wryly as he leaned against the boulder, suddenly too weak to stand unaided. "Had to gather a few friends," Cooper replied with a grim smile, gesturing to the Apache warriors. "Thought you might appreciate the help." Sarah rushed to Mason's side, her face paling at the sight of fresh blood soaking his shirt. "You're bleeding again," she said quickly, tearing a strip from her sleeve to press against the wound. "Worth it," Mason replied, his eyes fixed on Hargrove, who lay groaning on the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder. "He didn't get away." Hayes approached Hargrove cautiously, keeping his revolver trained on the fallen businessman. "Victor Hargrove, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and now jailbreak and the murder of two deputies." He knelt and secured Hargrove's hands with manacles, ignoring the man's cries of pain. "You'll hang for this, Hargrove. That I promise you." Hargrove's face, once handsome and commanding, was now twisted with hatred and fear. "This isn't over," he spat. "I have friends in high places. Judge Carlton." "Judge Carlton has been arrested by federal marshals," Sarah interrupted, still supporting Mason. "Agent Buchanan received a telegram from the territorial governor just after the explosion. Seems your ledgers provided enough evidence to implicate half the territorial government in your schemes." For the first time, genuine defeat registered on Hargrove's face. His empire was crumbling, his allies abandoning him, his carefully constructed world of power and privilege collapsing into ruin. "And the man you were waiting for at Eagle Pass," Hayes added, hauling Hargrove to his feet. "A deputy marshal from Tucson intercepted him 10 miles north of here. He's already singing like a canary, hoping to save his own neck." As Cooper and the Apache warriors secured the other gunmen, Mason felt his strength ebbing. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was fading, leaving only pain and encroaching darkness. His legs buckled, and he would have fallen if Sarah hadn't caught him. "Mason!" Her voice seemed to come from very far away. "Stay with me." He tried to respond, but the words wouldn't form. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was Sarah's face above him, her eyes filled with tears, yet burning with a fierce determination that told him more clearly than words ever could that she would not let him go. Mason's return to consciousness was gradual, a slow surfacing through layers of darkness and pain. He became aware first of soft linen against his skin, then the scent of herbs and antiseptic, and finally the gentle pressure of a hand holding his own. He opened his eyes to find himself back in Dr. Sullivan's clinic, sunlight streaming through the window at an angle that suggested late afternoon. Sarah sat beside his bed, her head bent over a book in her lap, her hand unconsciously maintaining its hold on his. "How long?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible. Sarah's head jerked up the book, forgotten, as relief flooded her face. 3 days, she answered, reaching for a cup of water and helping him drink. "You lost a lot of blood." Dr. Sullivan had to reopen the wound to clean it properly, said you tore every stitch she'd put in. There was gentle scolding in her tone, but her eyes betrayed how close she thought she'd come to losing him. Hargrove, secure in the Tucson federal jail, along with Judge Carlton and several territorial officials implicated in his schemes. They're awaiting trial before a federal judge from California. Sarah smiled slightly. Agent Buchanan has been remarkably thorough in his investigation since the shooting. Amazing what a brush with scandal can do for a bureaucrat's efficiency. Mason tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that even the small movement caused. Sarah immediately adjusted his pillows to support him. Dr. Sullivan says you're not to move without assistance for at least another week, she admonished. You nearly died, Mason, again. Seems to be becoming a habit, he acknowledged with a wry smile. Cooper, the chief, both fine. Gray Eagle has returned to the Apache settlement. Cooper has been dividing his time between his people and town, helping to establish new agreements about water rights and land boundaries. She hesitated. Buchanan approved my father's northern route for the railroad. The Apache will retain their lands in Eagle Canyon with guaranteed water rights protected by federal treaty. Relief washed through Mason. The battle had been worth it then. Lives had been lost, including nearly his own, but justice, or something approximating it, had prevailed. And Hayes, recovering well. He's been officially commended by the territorial governor for his role in exposing Hargrove's corruption. Sarah's expression softened. He's a changed man, I think. Or perhaps he's simply remembered the man he once was beneath Hargrove's influence. Mason nodded, understanding better than most how a man could lose himself and then, through unexpected circumstances, find his way back to his true nature. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken understanding and the simple relief of survival. Mason studied Sarah's face, noting the fatigue that lingered in her eyes despite her obvious joy at his recovery. You should rest, he told her. You look exhausted. I've been busy, she replied with a small smile. Someone had to manage affairs while you were indulging in extended sleep. And what affairs might those be? He asked, curious about what had transpired in the town during his unconsciousness. Sarah's expression grew more serious. Prosperity is at a crossroads. With Hargrove gone, the economic future of the town is uncertain. The mine will continue operations under new management, but without Hargrove's eastern connections, expansion will be slower. She straightened in her chair, and Mason recognized the determined set of her jaw. I've been working with Cooper and some of the independent miners to establish a fair water-sharing agreement. And I've started organizing my father's engineering notes for the railroad company. Sounds like you've found your place, Mason observed. Perhaps. Her eyes met his, searching. And what about you, Captain Blackwood? Now that your ghosts have been laid to rest, what comes next? It was the question Mason had avoided for 15 years, always assuming that his future would be a continuation of his solitary present. But now, looking at the remarkable woman beside him, he found himself considering possibilities he had long since abandoned. I'm not sure, he admitted. My cabin's gone. The ranch will need rebuilding. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Might be good to have a partner in such an undertaking. Sarah's hand tightened around his. Might be, she agreed softly. Especially if that partner had some engineering knowledge that could be useful in designing improvements. I was thinking more about her courage, intelligence, and unwillingness to back down from a fight, Mason replied, a warmth in his voice that surprised even him. The engineering knowledge would just be an added benefit. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Dr. Sullivan entered, followed by Sheriff Hayes, whose side was still bandaged, but who moved with increasing ease. Well, the prodigal returns, Sullivan remarked, seeing Mason awake. She approached the bed and began checking his wound with professional efficiency. I ought to bill you double for making me redo all my fine stitching. Send the bill to Hargrove, Mason suggested. Seems only fair, considering he's the reason I needed them in the first place. Sullivan snorted, but couldn't quite suppress her smile. The wound is healing well despite your best efforts to reopen it. Another week of rest, and you might be fit to sit on the porch. No riding, no fighting, and absolutely no chasing outlaws through mountain passes. Doctor's orders. Sarah confirmed her tone, making it clear she intended to enforce these restrictions personally. Hayes stepped forward, looking more relaxed than Mason had ever seen him. The perpetual tension that had characterized the sheriff during his years under Hargrove's influence had eased, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had found his way back to his principles. "Thought you'd want to know," Hayes said. "The telegram came through this morning. Federal judge has set Hargrove's trial date for next month in San Francisco. They want all of us there to testify you miss Fleming Cooper, the chief, if he's willing." He paused. "Should be quite a sensation when the full story comes out." "And the Apache lands?" Mason asked. "The agreements will hold." Hayes nodded. Buchanan made sure of that before he left. Filed the paperwork himself with the Department of the Interior. The Northern Railroad route will proceed as planned, preserving the canyon and water rights. A wry smile crossed his face. "Seems our government agent found his conscience after nearly losing it permanently." "People can surprise you," Mason observed with a meaningful glance at Hayes that acknowledged the sheriff's own transformation. Hayes accepted the unspoken recognition with a slight nod. "Rest up, Blackwood. Town's going to need men like you in the coming months. Rebuilding prosperity the right way won't be easy." After Hayes and Sullivan departed, Sarah remained at Mason's bedside, her expression thoughtful. "He's right, you know. Prosperity will need to rebuild, not just physically, but morally. Hargrove's influence corrupted more than just the officials he bribed. He changed how people thought about progress, about what matters in a community." "And you're planning to be part of that rebuilding," Mason said, not a question but a recognition of her commitment. "I am," she confirmed. "My father believed in this town's potential not as Hargrove's personal empire, but as a place where people of different backgrounds could build something meaningful together." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I'd like to see that vision realized." Mason reached for her hand again, his decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. "Then I suppose I'll need to stick around. Someone has to make sure you don't take on the whole territory single-handed." Sarah's smile was like sunrise breaking over the canyon, radiant, warm, and full of promise. "Is that your roundabout way of saying you're staying, Captain Blackwood?" "It is," he confirmed, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. "Though I'm not sure the captain part applies anymore. Just Mason will do." "Just Mason," she repeated softly, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I think I can work with that." Outside the window, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across Prosperity's main street. In houses and businesses throughout the town, lamps were being lit against the coming darkness, small beacons of light that together pushed back the night. In that moment, Mason Blackwood felt something he had not experienced since before Gettysburg hope. Not the desperate hope of a condemned man seeking reprieve, but the quiet, steadfast hope of someone who has passed through darkness and emerged battered but unbroken into the light of a new day. The ghosts of his past would always be with him, the men who had died under his command, the years spent in self-imposed exile, the weight of decisions made and paths not taken. But now, perhaps, they could rest easier, knowing that their captain had finally found his way home. 6 months later, the transformation of prosperity was well underway. The scars of Hargrove's reign remained visible. The half-completed buildings he had commissioned stood as monuments to arrested ambition, but new growth had begun to emerge around and through the remnants of the old order. The railroad construction had reached the outskirts of town, bringing with it the promise of connection to the wider world. The northern route, following Robert Fleming's original survey, skirted Apache lands, while still providing the access to markets that prosperity needed to thrive. The compromise once thought impossible was proving beneficial to all parties, a testament to what could be accomplished when greed was removed from the equation. Mason stood on the newly constructed porch of his ranch house, surveying the land that stretched before him. The original cabin had been beyond salvaging after Hargrove's men burned it, but the new structure was larger, sturdier, designed with an engineer's precision and a frontiersman's practical knowledge. The combination, like so much else in his life, now represented the union of his past and Sarah's influence on his future. Penny for your thoughts. Ghost. Cooper approached on horseback, raising a hand in greeting as he neared the house. In the months since Hargrove's defeat, Cooper had emerged as a respected liaison between prosperity and the Apache settlement, his unique background allowing him to bridge cultural divides that had once seemed insurmountable. "Just admiring the view," Mason replied, gesturing for his friend to join him on the porch. "How are things at the settlement?" Cooper dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post before climbing the steps. "Good. The council has approved the final water-sharing agreement. My father says it's the first treaty with white men that he actually believes might be honored." He accepted the cup of coffee Mason offered. The young men are still restless, but having meaningful work on the railroad construction has helped channel their energy. "And the new school Sarah's organizing." A smile crossed Cooper's face. "4 Apache children have enrolled already. My father is skeptical, but he recognizes the need for our people to understand the white man's ways if we're to survive in this changing world." He took a sip of coffee, his expression growing more serious. "The verdict from San Francisco arrived by telegram this morning." Mason nodded, having expected this news. He and Sarah had traveled to San Francisco 2 months earlier to testify at Hargrove's trial, an experience that had been both grueling and cathartic. Facing the man who had nearly destroyed everything they valued had required courage, but walking away afterward, leaving Hargrove to face justice while they returned to building their future, had been its own form of victory. "Guilty on all counts," Cooper continued. 20 years in federal prison. The judge made a point of mentioning the attempted genocide of the Apache in his sentencing remarks. "Good," Mason said simply. No punishment could truly compensate for the damage Hargrove had caused, the lives lost, the communities fractured, the trust destroyed, but knowing he would spend the remainder of his vital years behind bars provided some measure of closure. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Sarah rode into view, her hair loosened from its usual practical arrangement by the wind, her face flushed with exertion and purpose. Mason felt the familiar warmth that her presence always kindled within him, a sensation that even after 6 months continued to surprise and gratify him in equal measure. "Cooper, I'm glad you're here," she called as she dismounted. "I've just come from a meeting with the railroad engineers. They've agreed to hire 10 more Apache workers for the bridge construction." She bounded up the porch steps, pausing to place a quick kiss on Mason's cheek before turning back to Cooper. "And the company doctor has agreed to train 2 of your people in basic medical care." Cooper's expression reflected pleased surprise. "That's more than we asked for." "The new superintendent is considerably more reasonable than his predecessor," Sarah replied with a knowing smile. The fact that the previous superintendent had been one of Hargrove's closest allies, now serving his own prison sentence for fraud, remained unspoken but understood. As they moved inside to discuss the details of the new arrangements, Mason was struck by how naturally Sarah had assumed the role of advocate and mediator. Her father's daughter, in every sense she had, channeled her grief and anger into constructive action, becoming a force for positive change in a community still finding its new identity. Their relationship had developed with similar organic certainty. After his recovery, Mason had initially planned to rebuild his ranch alone, maintaining the independence that had defined his life for so long. But Sarah had appeared at the construction site one morning, architectural drawings in hand, offering improvements to his design that he couldn't reasonably reject. From there, her presence had become first a regular occurrence, then an expectation, and finally an essential component of his reimagined life. They had been married 3 months ago in a simple ceremony at the new church, with Cooper standing as Mason's best man and Dr. Sullivan supporting Sarah. Chief Gray Eagle had attended his presence, a powerful symbol of the changing relationships between the communities. Even Hayes had made an appearance, uncomfortable in his formal attire, but genuine in his congratulations. Now, as Mason watched Sarah animatedly discussing irrigation techniques with Cooper, he reflected on the strange, winding path that had led him to this moment. 15 years of self-imposed exile, of running from his past, had culminated not in the lonely death he had once anticipated, but in a second chance at a life of meaning and connection. Later that evening, after Cooper had departed and the household had settled into its nighttime routine, Mason and Sarah sat together on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The air was cool, but not cold, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "I received a letter from Agent Buchanan today," Sarah mentioned, breaking the comfortable silence. "He's been promoted to Director of the Western Territories Division. Says he wants to use prosperity as a model for future settlements, balanced development that respects indigenous rights while allowing for economic growth." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Quite a conversion for a man who was once in Hargrove's pocket." "People can change when shown a better path," Sarah replied, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. "Some just need more convincing than others." The philosophical observation hung between them, applying as much to Mason's own transformation as to Buchanan's or Hayes's. From the bitter, isolated man she had first encountered to the engaged, forward-looking husband beside her, now Mason's journey had been perhaps the most profound of all. "Cooper mentioned the verdict," Sarah said after another comfortable silence. 20 years seems both too much and not enough somehow." Mason understood the complex emotions behind her words. Justice is rarely perfect, but Hargrove's legacy is being dismantled piece by piece. That matters more than the man himself now. Sarah nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. "My father would be pleased, I think, not just about the railroad route or the water rights, but about what prosperity is becoming." She paused, her next words carrying a weight of personal significance. "He would have liked you, too, once he got past your stubborn exterior." Mason chuckled softly. The Fleming women seemed to have a talent for that particular excavation. As night fully claimed the landscape, transforming the familiar daytime vistas into shadowed mystery, Mason felt the rightness of where they had arrived, not just physically in this house they had built together, but spiritually and emotionally as well. The ghosts that had haunted him since Gettysburg had not vanished entirely, but they had been joined by new companions, hope, purpose, and the quiet certainty that his life still held meaning. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the lonely sound echoing across the valley. Another answered, then another, until the night was filled with their chorus, separate voices, finding harmony in their shared song. "We should go in," Sarah suggested eventually, though she made no move to rise. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," Mason replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. I'm still admiring the view. The stars continued their ancient procession across the heavens, bearing witness to the small human dramas unfolding beneath their eternal gaze. In prosperity lamps glowed in windows, marking the presence of families and individuals going about their evening routines. At the Apache settlement, cook fires cast their own warm light into the darkness, sustaining traditions that had endured for generations. And on the porch of a newly built ranch house, a man who had once been lost found himself exactly where he was meant to be, with the ghosts of his past, finally at peace and the promise of tomorrow awaiting the dawn.